and Open Space Conservancy Trust. My name is Peter Struck, and I'm the Park and Recreation Commission Chair. Soon to be sitting next to me is the Open Space Conservancy Trust Chair, Geraldine Poor, and she will be co-chairing tonight with me. Tonight's hybrid joint meeting is in person at the Mercer Island Community and Events Center, and we are also using video conferencing technology provided by Zoom. The Zoom video of this meeting is being recorded and will be uploaded to the city's YouTube channel later this week. Other public audience members are listening to the meeting by telephone or via the internet. Additionally, the city has opened up the community center to provide public space for viewing and participating in the meeting. Welcome to all, and thank you for joining us tonight. In Chair Poor's absence, I will ask the trustees of the Open Space Conservancy Trust, please have your microphones turned on, and if participating remotely, please have your cameras turned on for the roll call, and will city staff please call the roll for the Open Space Conservancy Trust.
Thank you, Chair. Chair Poor.
Present.
Vice Chair Atay. Vice Chair Atay. Uh-oh. I'll come back. Secretary Bender.
Here.
Trustee Brissett.
Here.
Trustee Olson.
Here.
Council Liaison Jacobson.
Here.
Trustee Hildebrandt.
Here.
Vice Chair Atay.
Here.
Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you. Park and Recreation Commissioners, please have your microphones turned on for the roll call. And will city staff please call a roll for the Park and Recreation Commission?
Thank you, Chair. Chair Struck.
Here.
Vice Chair Burstein.
Present.
Commissioner McCarthy.
Present.
Commissioner Hay.
Here.
Commissioner Cohen.
Here.
Commissioner Markson. Commissioner Westberg. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. For this hybrid meeting, Chair Poor and I will do our best to recognize you in the order of which hands are raised. After being recognized, you may ask your question. Our first item of business tonight is public appearances. This is the opportunity for anyone to speak to the commission and trust about any item, except items requiring a public hearing in any quasi-judicial matters or campaign-related matters. City staff, is there anyone who has signed up for appearances that wishes to address the commissioner trust tonight?
There are no public appearances tonight, Chair.
Thank you. If there are no appearances, then we will move on. The only item of special business tonight is the open space zone discussion. And for that, we are going to welcome our city manager, Jesse Vaughn.
Good evening. Thank you for coming together again tonight. Before we begin, I just want to acknowledge many of the staff people here tonight have been working in emergency since last night. I think collectively we've had about 2 hours of sleep. So we're here, bear with us. What I'd like to do though, Elaine Summergren is here and may need to leave to go back to the Emergency Operations Center. So if the boards would indulge me, I would like to skip ahead and have a discussion about the two items that we left undefined in your code. That's signs and kiosks and trail standards. Those are two things I need Elaine for, and then if she needs to leave, we'll be able to do that. After we conclude that discussion, what I'd recommend we do is go back to the top of the draft ordinance and work our way through that. Does that work for everyone tonight? Thank you very much for your flexibility. Let's start with signs and kiosks. I'll do a little intro, and then I think similar to the last meeting, I'm not looking for the text to be written tonight, but I would welcome you sharing your thoughts and ideas, and also I'd like to invite our team members on Parks Maintenance and Natural Resources side to share what they think our needs are. Signs. Really tough to regulate in a zoning code. The theme of the conversation when we last met was less is more. We tinkered around with how do you put that into a code, and it really doesn't work too well. But we're happy to talk about it again. We also agree with you that less is more, and that is how we practice the placement of signs in our parks, facilities, trails, open space areas. However, there are times when we have to place additional signs, so we don't want to be too restrictive. I'm not even sure we want to regulate signs at all in your park zone code. I'll give you an example from a recent situation. The bike skills area, we just recently worked with our insurance company on the placement of additional signs for safety. So we wouldn't want a zoning code that prohibited us doing important work like that. So that's signs. Kiosks is a little bit different. Kiosks are typically a structure that we use to post information, and they're almost always at the entrance to a facility. I have seen regulations previously where kiosks are limited by size, so we can probably pursue something like that. Elaine, before I turn it back to Chair for open discussion, did you or Sam have anything that you wanted to share about this code? And I will actually say I'd like Eileen to share a little bit about federal law related to signage, but operationally, Elaine or Sam, anything else you'd like us to consider?
Good evening. For the record, Elaine Summergren, Deputy Public Works Director. I'm not sure there's anything very specific that we have right this moment, although we may chime in as the discussion goes on. I think one of the other things that we just wanted to bring up is that although we are talking about signs and kiosks, there are other needs in our open spaces. As some of you know, if you walk around, you see our mutt mitt boxes. And so things like that it may be appropriate to put in this category. So just something to think about. Sam, do you have anything? Here.
Yeah, Sam Howard, Parks Operations Manager. I would pretty much agree with that. Sometimes there's a need to utilize signs and kiosks for additional information, whether it's outreach activities or, don't feed the ducks, pamphlets related to, dog rules and things like that. So although we do get, a lot of requests for, anytime there's a problem, there could be a request, hey, we need a sign for this, we need a sign for that. That's not always the, appropriate response, but so I do want to make sure that we are, conservative with putting signs in the parks, but needs do arise.
And Eileen, did you want to share anything just about law and case law, actually?
Sure. For the record, Eileen Kiefer, Madrona Law, we're your contract assistant city attorneys. Just a brief overview just of signs. Sign code is tricky under law, under both federal case law as well as state law. Just two things I want to kind of keep floating around in the back of your head as we work through this exercise tonight. The first is that generally sign regulation is tricky because it is a First Amendment issue. The general rule of thumb is if you have to read the sign, your sign regulations are not going to pass muster under federal scrutiny. And then the second thing is City Manager Bond alluded to this earlier about working with insurance for certain signage is that, we are talking about open spaces and parks. There can be recreational immunity and other reasons why we might want certain signs for safety or other sort of alerts to the public of conditions that may be hazardous, things like that. And so certainly from a liability perspective, I think the interest would just be not tying our hands so we could get the signs out that we needed as recommended by the city's risk pool.
Could you turn back?
Okay. Before you start the discussion, I was wondering if anybody from the Open Space Conservancy Trust wanted to talk about if there's any kind of sign guidance regulation that the trust works off of. If not, that's fine, but I was just curious if anybody knew that. All right. Oh, trustee Hildebrand. Oh, you didn't. Okay, sorry. All right, well, then let's just open it up. I mean, I just was jotting down some notes. I mean, clearly, you know, I can think of it kind of from two perspectives. One is kind of, well, what type of signs, like safety, wayfaring? I mean, there's maybe 3 or 4 other ones we could potentially list out a few as examples. And then there's kind of the, well, okay, if we need a sign for safety, okay, should there be size requirements, language, color, and so forth? So just some ideas there. So I'll open it up for thoughts. And I think as the city manager said, we're not looking to wordsmith it by any means, but just more things to think about. And, you know, they can come, staff will come back at the next meeting. Commissioner Cohen.
Don Cohen, yeah, thank you. I'm looking at Rory Westberg's comments, his under development standards, under B, standards for signage. I'm not ready in my mind to address kiosks at the moment. But if I had to suggest something with a few modifications of his wording and in light of what has already been stated, I would do something like this, that signage should be used sparingly and should use natural materials, simple design, natural colors that blend in, no reflective or illuminated surfaces, unless public safety concerns clearly dictate otherwise, or something like that. And the assistant city attorney can come up with the right words. But I'm not sure I would go drill down to say, okay, you can have them for wayfaring, you can have them for this. And that's why I said, okay, so we're going to use them sparingly, and that may be the wrong adverb. But these kinds of things from an appearance point of view, and that everything is trumped by public safety, is sort of the something that seemed comfortable to me.
Thank you. Trustee Hildebrand.
Thank you. Yes, I also believe that the purpose of safety is important use of signage, and I don't think we can get around that. In looking over the kinds of amenities that we're considering putting into or allowing in open space, I was trying to come up with a kind of a general principle for deciding whether such an amenity would be appropriate. And the general ideas that I came up with is something that either enhances the safety of the users or enhances the goal of environmental preservation within the open space. And certainly signs giving rules on user conduct and directions on how to find trails and such like that are quite appropriate in my view.
Okay, thank you. Other thoughts? Do people like what they've heard from Don and Thomas? Oh, Hillary, trustee Elton.
Can you hear me all?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, thank you. I know that a recurring theme that comes up in our group is that we talk about how we are going to work on educational initiatives in Pioneer. And we do have some antiquated, well, I mean, not antiquated, but aged out signage that I believe maybe was part of a scout project or something in the Northwest. And I know we've had conversations about like, how do we boost educational signage in the parks? And I don't know where that falls in terms of kiosk or sign. And then another theme that comes up is how we talk to people about the indigenous history of the land where we are and the ongoing stories of the people who have stewarded this land. So I'm curious what our thoughts are on that.
Thank you. Commissioner Hay.
Thanks. I just wanted to second what Commissioner Cohen brought up. I agree with what Commissioner Westberg emailed to us about the natural theme, using natural materials. So I would just second that comment.
Thank you. Trustee Bender.
Yes, I mean, I agree with all that was said, and I'm just wondering if maybe the way to kind of put a bow around it is to just tie those thoughts to it needs to be in support of the purpose of the open space. So, so we don't end up with signs that are not related to the use of the open space. I mean, for example, I'm not really thinking that I would like to see a sign that said this way to the bathroom, even if we have a bathroom. I think they ought to be signs that are related to how does a person use the park in the way it was intended to be used. And I totally agree with, things need to fit into the natural environment, and be as inconspicuous as possible.
Thank you. Vice Chair Burstein.
It's Paul Burstein. Two questions come to mind. The current signs related to dogs, those are not natural materials, if I'm not sick. Yeah, they're not. So we have existing signs that would have to be converted. And the second question I would have is, what is the longevity of those natural signs, especially ones like the dog regulations that are pretty detailed, and have a lot of information on them. And I just wonder, it's not just a simple sign that says dogs off leash, dogs on leash. Would that restrict us too much if everything is in the using natural materials? Having it fit in to the park, I think, through the design is achievable. And I'm concerned if we are restricting ourselves too much in anticipation of the signage that we might put in the park.
But when you have a minute, Peter.
City Manager.
I might ask us to do some further exploration around the requirement for natural materials. I think it is going to pose a real operational challenge for us. They're not going to hold up, and we're going to be replacing signs. So operationally, that's may not be practical, but we support the theme of, I think where you're going, Commissioner Burstein, designed to align with the natural environment, natural colors, things like that. I liked what Commissioner Cohen said. If you can give us that trap door, if it's a public safety need, because the other thing that stood out to me with Commissioner Westberg's comments was the no reflective material that is used when we have safety needs. Also remember that we're depending on what the sign says or does, there's often accessibility requirements that are included in that sign. Some people with limited eyesight, they may need a different type of sign. So there's all these things that we get into when we talk about signs. So I wanted to offer the staff perspective. Eileen, before I give up the floor, I want to go back to this conversation around content. I believe content is going to be really tough for us to regulate, but the design standards will be easier, like natural colors. Can you just go over that one more time for us?
Sure, let me turn my video on too for those who are remote. Thank you, City Manager Bond. That's under federal case law. This is United States Supreme Court precedent. Like I said, the rule of thumb is if you have to read the sign in order to apply the regulations, that's generally not going to be permissible. So when we're talking about this type of sign, the classic example is political signs, right? Like political signs will be subject to blah, blah, blah. That doesn't fly under the federal case law. So the way, and you guys actually have in Mercer Island have a pretty recent sign code. You guys just did this a couple of years ago, if memory serves. I didn't write it, but whoever did an excellent job because it categorizes signs based on sort of like where they're going to be. Wall signs, projecting signs, window signs, and it does sort of the design standard things that I am hearing today too about, it will look like this. These can be the types of materials, reflectiveness, lighting, that kind of thing, as opposed to saying, well, this type of sign is okay and that for this purpose. And that type of sign is not okay. Because again, if you're if you have to read the sign to figure out how to apply your code, then we may have a problem. So one thing I'm doing is I'm working on some language here that maybe can get to the concerns of the trustees and the commissioners in a way that we think might pass federal muster.
Okay, Councilmember Jacobson.
Also expressed by statutes on, I guess I have two hats. I think his initial guidance, I thought what, Commissioner Cohen had to say was good spirit. And and having a safety element in it, and I think, Commissioner Page is on the same page. And I understand about the reflective signs. There are, for example, some trails that we have that are dangerous for somebody who couldn't meet any ADA standard. Specifically referring to ones that are on the very south of 84th and south of East Mercer Way. There's some trails that go down through a swamp. I think that sparing is the initial guidance and safety is the factor that should be in there. If they have to be reflective, certain ones probably have to be for safety reasons, so be it. Might also be helpful to see what size we have existing right now, because we may have not a big problem.
Okay, thank you for that. Oh, Sam.
Yeah, I just want to provide a little bit more information. You'd asked earlier about the signs that were existing in Pioneer Park and what the standards were, and I just looked it up real quick. They're basically in 4 categories. So boundary marking, informational and map signs, interpretive signs, and entry signs. And then the entry signs are replaced as they deteriorate with new signs per park department standards. And as far as standards, that's something that we did with a designer several years ago, where we do have like a binder of what the entry signs are supposed to look like and whatnot.
Thank you. Trustee Bender.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, maybe another thing we ought to be thinking about is location of the sign, not necessarily how it's made, but as we've done in Pioneer Park, the larger kiosk kind of signs, the directional signs, the park rule signs are all on the exterior of the park. So they're at the entrances and within the sort of the edge of the park, not in the interior. So I think the location is something that we ought to focus on. Unless, for example, we decide that we need to put up or want to put up something that speaks specifically to an area, for example, an area where we're doing a restoration project, we might want to put a temporary sign up there that says, hey, we're doing this restoration work and here's what it's about and thank you for your cooperation. Something like that in the interior would be appropriate. But for the most part, other than signs that are related to the trails, ought to be on the exterior of the park. I'm also having trouble with this First Amendment concept, and maybe, Eileen, you could give us an example of a sign that requires you to read it to understand the regulation. For example, the dog rules in the park. How could that violate a First Amendment standard?
I think Marie or Eileen, it would be something like if your code said rules related to dogs are allowed, I believe that sign may not be permissible under case law, because you have to read the sign to understand the type of sign that's being regulated. Am I getting it in the ballpark?
Yes, city manager, you absolutely are. Again, the idea is to not regulate based on the content of the sign. So the idea is that signs in and of themselves are protected speech under the First Amendment. Typically, you see it applied to things like commercial speech, right? A lot of signs are for businesses and things like that. And so it's sort of a strange case law. It is kind of counterintuitive. So, and it has made sign codes certainly a challenge for both Mercer Island and all the other jurisdictions we serve. So what I think we can address things like locations of signs, that would be fine. And because in fact, that's how the Mercer Island Code looks at things now. It's a matter of, it's when you boil it down to categories like signs for this purpose, signs for that purpose, and you start looking at it that way, then we might have to take a closer look at it. Like I said, we're going to work on some language because what we're hearing here, you know, I think are concerns that can be addressed. We just may take a little bit of wordsmithing on our part.
So we can have a dog regulation. And we can have a rule that says there can be signs related to the purpose of the park. As long as it doesn't say you have to have a sign about dog regulations. Is that kind of what I'm hearing?
Actually, Trustee Bender, we may not, keyword may not be able to say we can only have signs related to the purpose of.
Okay.
But we control that property, so we would not allow the placement of other types of signs necessarily, but our regulations will have to be in alignment with that Supreme Court case.
Okay.
As Eileen noted, is a very challenging case.
Okay. All right. That makes some sense. Thank you.
Commissioner Cohen.
Well, what about the public safety? Can you do that? I mean, can you have putting aside materials and appearance and things like that? Could you say you can have signs, but only if they're reasonably related to protection of public safety?
Frankly, I'd have to,
I'd close call.
I'd have to think about that a little bit in the context. Again, the Supreme Court case isn't quite the perfect fit for what we're doing here. What we're doing here is quite unique. But I think what we're wanting to do is in the spirit of less is more. First of all, the city already has a chapter regulating signs citywide. So we don't need to necessarily reinvent the wheel in this particular zone. So please keep that in mind of, you know, you don't have to do all the work yourselves, at least, is there's resources in the code we can already rely on. But what I think staff is looking for is a balance between, is first of all, compliance with law, but then also for purposes of reducing liability as people are using parks and people might get hurt. Safety signage becomes important. And like City Manager Bond alluded to, sometimes that involves working very closely with the city's risk pool to ensure that we have the appropriate signage to protect ourselves from a tort liability perspective. So those are just two things that are balancing. We've kind of thrown a lot at you, and I'm worried that the groups are getting hung up on these legal principles. It's helpful to hear you all talk. And like I said, we can wordsmith and come back to you, hopefully with something that's both legally defensible and getting at what the board and the trust are looking to accomplish here tonight.
Vice Chair Burstein.
Just wanted to point out there are signs in the interior of the park that are made of natural material. They're wayfarer signs. And I would not want to see those eliminated.
Thank you. Sure.
Hi, I have a simple clarification also. I'm aware of signage that we put up when maintenance is using materials that warrant signing. So the Forest Health Plan, I think, requires certain public education about what chemicals are being used when there is chemical treatment. So I would add that in.
Okay. Does staff have sufficient, the one question that I have outstanding perhaps is, I've heard a couple of individuals kind of speak for or against wayfaring style signs. And I just wanted to get kind of a consensus of the combined group of whether wayfaring is a legitimate purpose of a sign within the open space zone. Just because I think safety and some of these other purposes I think are fairly we've cut and dry, if you will. But Jody.
For me, when I think of wayfaring, I think having them, it would make sense to have like where two paths cross. so that you can understand which, where you're going. Whether it says this way to the ravine, or so that you, if you do get disoriented, you can reorient yourself and not get lost in the middle.
Okay. Trustee Hildebrand.
Yes, from the standpoint of environmental preservation, having some markings that help users find the established trails and stay on them is a very, very good idea, I think. So,
Okay. All right, Commissioner Cohen.
Is this on?
yes.
I guess I'll have to repeat what I've said many times for 30 years. I'm not in favor of much in the way of wayfaring signs. I would not want to see, for example, with all respect to Jody, see signs at every one of the intersections in Pioneer Park, because I think it would detract from the experience. And I remember when this came up, Elaine, I think you remember it, and a woman had gotten lost. And so somebody on the staff was taking the lead on putting up many, or suggesting that many more signs be put in there. And my view was, can you imagine how unique that is to, 9 miles from a major city to be able to get lost and get down in the ravine, not hear anything, and you can't get lost very long. It's a quarter, it's 40 acres, a parcel. And so I don't know exactly how to craft the wording, and I suspect I'm in the minority on this point, but I still am sparingly, even though I get lost still once in a while, that's okay with me.
Okay. Maybe if we could just go around for a show of hands in terms of the use of signs, just using Don's term of sparingly, not eliminating them per se. And again, we would look to, obviously, the staff would have to use their thoughts and reasoning on a particular situation. But I think to kind of bring this to a close, sparingly in terms of the use of kind of directional or wayfaring signs. Okay. I think we've got a majority there, and we'll let you kind of work within that. Any other?
Trails. We're ready to talk about trails. Okay. Elaine, we have been pulled off into an emergency, and I didn't have time to ask you today. Do you have the photo deck? Okay. I think it's appropriate in the open space zoning code to establish development regulations related to trails. We ran out of a little bit of steam in trying to figure that out, and we'd like to look to you to help us with that. What we thought might be helpful to you is we took some photos out in the field of the various types of trails that we have. Some are in parks, but we wanted to show you all the types of things that you might need to consider. And then I'm open to your feedback on how we might approach this section. Elaine, the floor is yours.
Okay. So I am going to pull up a slide deck, and I will tell you, it is not all recent photos. Some of them are construction photos, because I wanted you to be able to see not just the structures or the types of trails that we have in our parks, but also how they're built and what the impact of that building is, because there's different levels of impact on open spaces as we put in these types of trails that are appropriate for the situations. I do apologize. As Jesse said, I had hoped to clean this up a little bit, so it's a bit of a hodgepodge. Just bear with me. It's an interesting photo tour no matter what. Okay. Oh, did I go? Okay. So the first one that I have here is I wanted to show some examples of trails that we build on hillsides. So hillsides are particularly tricky. Sometimes you can get away with just banking the dirt along those trails, but sometimes we are required to put in some sort of a retaining structure or some sort of buildup on the downhill side. And that's often done with rock that is imported. We don't have a lot of natural rock on the island to build with. So we import this rock to build these. And here's just two examples of those trails being built. On the left is, I believe this is the original construction of the Southeast 53rd Open Space Trail, the Traverse, the long one. There's quite a bit of rock work on there. And then on the right side, this is a more recent example. This is actually on the Hawthorne Trail in Luther Burbank Park, the one that comes up from the amphitheater. So just some examples of that while it's in construction. And then here's a more recent example of some trail construction. So I did a kind of a photo array of from the beginning to where we are now. This is the South Shoreline Trail that was just completed between the Boiler Building and the swim beach at Luther Burbank Park. These aren't all open spaces. I think it, per this zone, but I think they're all still relevant. You can see on the left here, there's vegetation removal, some tree removal. It tends to be quite muddy as we're getting going. Then you can see some of the rock work going in there with a gravel bed. And then on the right side, although it looks paved, it is not. It's actually just a compacted gravel trail. And this is one that was actually designed with the slope in mind and the water load that we're going to get off of that slope so that it's shedding water and it's able to stand up over time. Here's just an example. This was a trail that was built in Gallagher Hill Open Space, I believe about 10 years ago now. So usually we're having to move large woody debris. Sometimes that is used in the actual construction of the trail. Sometimes we need to bring in timbers. You can see on the right there is a timber structure that we were putting in to, instead of rockery, to put in something to lift the trail so that it would be more flat on the side of a hillside. So just looking at how that's made. Here is the bridge construction. If you've been to Gallagher Hill Open Space, you'll know we have two bridges quite close together. And this is some of the work that was involved in building those. You can see on the left here, we are highlining in some large rocks for stabilizing the slope. And then on the right, you can see those wooden forms there are actually concrete abutments that were being formed up and poured in as a basis for those bridge structures. And those are water courses where you see the no step there. We didn't want any erosion into those water courses as they were being built. This is the Pioneer Bridge, or right in the northeast quadrant of Pioneer Park. This is actually when it was being built originally. We have had to do some repairs on it as trees have taken down bits and pieces, but the finished product is on the right side. The Ellis Pond Boardwalk. So boardwalks are another type of structure that we see in some of our parks because we do have wetlands around our parks. Ellis Pond is a perfect example of that. Here you see the original construction on the left side. And then I think on the right side, I'm not sure if this is right when it was completed or during one of our refinishing treatments. And this is one that I wanted to highlight. This was more recent. This is within the last 10 years. This was the completion of the North Wetland Boardwalk at Luther Burbank Park. If you'll recall, that boardwalk used to actually end and just had a lookout at the end. And we continued that all the way to the north to connect to Calkins Point when Calkins Point was built. What I wanted to highlight here is that on the left side, you see a pile driver. So this is one of the circumstances in which we were putting in pin piles. And the reason we do this is in areas with highly saturated soils that we cannot just simply put a structure on top of them. We also want to get up out of potential water fluctuations and saturated soils. So the way that we do that is that these posts are hammered very, very far into the ground to provide stability. And then the boardwalk is built on top of that. So it's an elevated structure. And then you can see the grading here on the left that's put on top of those pin piles. This is a type of grading we use now on boardwalks because it allows for appropriate light penetration, which is actually a permit requirement. So That's an example of a pin pile structure. And this is the reason that I wanted to show this in particular is because this is probably a very similar structure to what we would need to do in parts of Hollerbach for the proposed trail. So it would be a similar kind of impact with an excavator coming in and hammering in those piles. This is the Upper Luther stairway construction. Again, that was done, I believe, in 2011 or so. On the left, it is in process, so going down a very steep hillside. A lot of that was actually carried in by hand, but this was all constructed on site to grade. A very large staircase structure. The Mercerdale Hillside, another fun structure that we are continually maintaining. So just a view of those timber crib steps there on the side. And when I say timber crib, that is it's surrounding, I think they're all 8x8 timbers, and then they are backfilled with a gravel mix. And so that stabilizes. That does need to be replenished over time. So in the middle, this was a volunteer event where we had high school students doing a bucket brigade to bring in gravel to re-gravel those stairs. And on the right is when we were rebuilding a section of that trail on the lower portion. New timber crib steps. Just a couple more stairways here. One of them is a rebuild of a stairway in the northeast quadrant of Pioneer Park. And on the right is actually, this used to be this is right below the Island Crest Park bathroom. This actually used to just be a very, very oversteepened grade with a lot of erosion on it. And so our trail specialist at the time, who is now our urban forestry project manager, he built this, designed and built this. And it's held up really well and functioned well on that very steep hillside. There's clearly a desire line there for people to access. This is a rarity in our open spaces, but I did want to just highlight it, which is that we do have a paved trail in Pioneer Park. It's in the northeast quadrant along the west edge, just parallel to Island Crest Way. And we have had to do repairs on it over the years because we've had some root intrusion and buckling and making sure that we're re-leveling it so that we aren't creating tripping hazards. So we monitor that. I wanted to just highlight a few, drainage is probably the thing we do most in terms of dealing with the upkeep of trails. So what tends to happen is that trails over time get a lot of organics on them, which then as they're worked into the soil and mixed with water, turn to mud. So we tend to get trails dishing out is what we call it. So they're scooping out in the middle. And the way that we deal with this is we bring in a base course of rock, which is usually like quarry spall or something a little bit smaller, especially down the spine of the trail. And then we top dress it with a finer gravel over the top so that it's actually the opposite of dished out. It's more convex so that the water will sheet off the trail. And this is particularly important in flat areas. So think about the northwest quadrant of Pioneer Park where we have very flat topography and water is not sheeting off of trails. So we need to think about how we build and maintain those trails a little differently than we do in areas with slopes. And you can see here, this is the top dressing on the right side here. We're just laying down gravel and then compacting it and really shaping that trail. I also wanted to just highlight, I'm sure you're all familiar in the Northwest Quadrant, we have some very popular trails that, although they were not built to be this wide, are very wide, especially on the west side of the park. I would hazard a guess that some of them are probably upwards of 20, 25 feet wide. There's been impacts to people like to walk multiple people abreast, and then there are impacts to the vegetation on the side. There's a lot of dog activity in this quadrant, and these things do have effects on how wide the trails become over time. So although they are not necessarily designed in that way. And I will stop sharing.
Great.
I will be facilitating this section, so who,
I thought maybe just, if anybody has any questions for Elaine, kind of just on those picture specifics, for example, two thoughts I had is, in terms of trail width, which I know is kind of a hot button from time to time, you know, I guess the last picture showed something of 20+ feet. When you design them, what's kind of the range you would look at for most trails, just kind of to benchmark?
I may defer to Sam here, but I would say generally we're looking at about 5 to 6 feet wide.
And then just a second question, if I can follow up on the paved trail in Pioneer Park, kind of along Parallels Island Crest. Was it paved for ADA, so that there was you could basically have somebody like in a wheelchair that could go all the way along Island Crest Way, or, you know, as opposed to, or was there some other reason for that?
I would need to go back and look at the actual master plan to find out, but I will tell you that that trail is named the bike trail. So that may have some indication for
Okay.
why it was, or what the original intent was for that
Thank you.
particular trail.
looking for hands? Tom, please.
Thank you. I
Trustee
recall
Hildebrand.
that among the materials that were distributed to people in the Open Space Conservancy Trust, there was a trails guideline booklet that was prepared by the original board that came up with the rules for the use of the park. So we could refer back to that. It contained in particular suggestions for minimum width for trails in the exterior and interior of the park, and with reference to how they were expected to be used. And along those lines, I think if there is a guidebook of standards that we use for our current trail construction and maintenance, that would be an excellent document to refer to externally, so that we don't have to contain all of the details within the description of the zone. We could simply refer to that document, and those are my comments.
Who else? Okay, all right. Commissioner Cohen.
I'm trying to get a little context in my mind about this, and with the city manager having said, give her some ideas. And so I'm thinking, because the last time we said that some trails are easements that the city has over private property, some are owned by the city. So I'm just sort of visualizing, I'm visualizing the Fleury Trail, for example. I'm visualizing the trail, I think that Council Member Jacobson was talking about, which goes down 59th and then through the Skunk Cabbage area down there, down to that area. And I don't know who owns that one. And I'm sort of thinking that as a general proposition, I think I want the same level of naturalness maintained in trails that I do for open space, and maybe even a little more depending on size, location, use, and things like that, to the extent you can do those kinds of things legally. But I'm having a little trouble just sort of context wise, because the photos were great, but those were primarily major park areas with trails in them. So I'm thinking more of these small gems. At least that's what's in my mind at the moment, not that the others aren't important.
You can probably see through that photo tour why we were struggling a little bit to write the regulations. I think we all have in our minds a natural surface trail, lightly tread upon. And yet what's happening in reality is we're stewarding, especially in some areas of our open space system, trails that are so heavily used, they've been over time widened. And so we do have to, we have to use a variety of construction and maintenance methods to manage them, to prevent that spread and for safety and other reasons. I think, I do think it would be appropriate in your development regulations at a minimum to put a trail width. What we could not come up with is an easy way to describe like materials. I think it's probably appropriate to direct us to look at softscape versus hardscape. We have techniques available to us that allow us to build ADA accessible trails with crushed gravel, very, very finely compacted, as Elaine showed in one of those earlier pictures. I think it's probably reasonable to not add any more pavement or concrete in your open space. So those were kind of some things we were kicking around, but we thought, you know what, let's share the photos and get all of you to help us with this a bit.
Chair Struck.
Question, when you design trails, do you think about the use, and I'm thinking, you know, bicycles versus pedestrians? And I guess I would think if you were designing for both, you would have it much wider as opposed to if it's kind of for single use. And I guess you could design it with probably some sharper turns or curves to kind of discourage bicycle use if that's what was desired. Just curious if that enters into the discussion at all.
It's certainly a consideration, right?
Yeah.
We can't not think about the various uses. I think the trickiest of all of those is always stairways. And we have purposely put in shoulders next to some stairways where we know there are going to be bicyclists that maybe push their bikes up, maybe some ride down. But I think maybe what you're referring to more is something like a multi-use trail.
Right.
And those generally aren't the types of trails we're looking at, you know, these really wide laned trails in open spaces. So.
Okay, thank you.
I saw trustee Bender first and then the council member.
So, having looked at those pictures from Elaine, that it kind of crystallized the issue for me, which is maybe the way to go about this is to just say the goal is to use a material that is the least impactful on the natural environment to meet the needs of the trail. So, for example, in Pioneer Park, we have really two distinct trail types. One is the exterior trail that is intended to be ADA accessible, so it needs to be a hard, compacted surface. The interior trails are, what you would expect out in a forest someplace. They're mostly, dirt, or in places where we need to, we've added gravel, that sort of thing. So it seems to me that the purpose of the trail has to dictate the material being used, but the overall concept ought to be use the material that's least intrusive on the natural environment. And I don't know whether this is the right place to bring it up, but I think we need to have a discussion about bicycles on open space trails, because my experience in Pioneer Park is they're not very compatible with the interior trails. It's hard for bicycles to come through, and there should be people on the trail at the same time. And the bicycles, more so than people, just dig up the trails and create issues that need to be fixed in the future with gravel or something like that. So I don't know whether that's for a later discussion, but that's just a part of the trail discussion from my perspective.
Councilmember Jacobs.
I was intrigued by what Mr. Hildebrand had to say about some manual that existed at some point that had some guidance on how trails were built or what the characteristics of it were. And you mentioned that there had been one at some point in the past, the Open Space Conservancy Trust had developed, or it came to birth in some manner or another. And I would suspect that the Parks Department and with Sam and Lane here, you probably have manuals that you use to refer to. And I wonder if it would make some sense to take a look at those and perhaps collapse them and use that as the point of departure, because the nature of the trails varies substantially all over the island, not only in parks, but in areas that are not in parks, that are just on private property and in open spaces. And in the considerations which Elaine's presentation illustrated, there are a lot of times that these are fairly complex, or not complex, complicated projects to do, and they require concrete or steel or, what have you. But I'd find it interesting to look at, see if those two things are in harmony, and look at that as the guide and simply refer trail building to that, unless otherwise, unless it's some kind of a unique situation which requires some kind of guidance from the open space people, or something that isn't covered. But I think that would make our task easier, be better direction for the construction people, and take into account their experience. Because if you look at some of these trails, obviously some of what's been done has evolved over time. I've lived here for 25 years and extensively used trails largely for walking dogs. And I've noticed quite different construction techniques and quality of construction, and also having to do with how do you keep that trail going. I'd add one other thing. And I'd say, I think when you're considering bikes, you need to consider scooters in parks as well, because they create some or maybe additional problems that bikes don't bring. So.
Commissioner Cohen.
Did I get this? Oh, no?
Yes, it's on.
No, thank you. So the trails that we're talking about now are trails that are in these open spaces, right? So the trails are going to be governed by whatever is in this open space zone as a general proposition. And now am I right that we're now talking about sort of special treatment for trails themselves as far as width or materials, things like that? Because we're not at the moment, we're not talking about like, for example, we're not talking about the Fleury Trail, because that's not on here. That may be something for later on, but I'm just mimicking what the city manager has told us before. Let's stick with the open space lands and deal with some of these other things later. So if the trails in there are already governed by whatever it is that the staff and this group and the planning commission and council come up with for open space, what does that leave separate for that's unique to trails other than width? I think the bicycle issue, as I understand it from Ryan Daly, that's something that's going to be dealt with on a island-wide basis, what you can do with bikes or not do with bikes on various properties around there. So I'm struggling a little bit of what's the problem we're trying to solve that's unique to trails, other than some of those specific kinds of things.
Elaine, did you have an answer? Direction?
I don't know that I have an answer. I had a thought though, which is that one of the things that we discuss, and I don't recall if this came up during our last meeting, so I apologize if it's redundant. But one of the primary reasons that we have open space is for habitat, and that connectivity and undisturbed space is really, really like a very important sort of keystone of the value of that space. So bisecting it with more trails is not a great thing. So finding that balance between the amount of trails in an open space that allows the public in and to appreciate the open space and to value it and be invested in it, but also not have an undue influence or impact on the value of the open space as habitat. We have dealt with this issue in Pioneer Park. We've had suggestions of, hey, this area doesn't have any trails in it. we should put a trail in there, and staff has actually advocated for really trying not to do that as much as possible. We have an extensive trail system. I only say this because as you're thinking about what the regulations are in open spaces, perhaps that's also something that you want to discuss. So not just the aspects of trail construction or materials, but maybe how much of the open space you want impacted by trails.
Appreciate your bringing that up. That's where some of my thoughts were going also, this idea of decommissioning trails that aren't really necessary or highly used. And at one point in my term on the Open Space Conservation Trust Board, there was this issue of social trails and some of the trails that come in from private property and whether those should be allowed. And I believe where we landed on that, I'm trying to remember who was in that conversation along with us, was contact with the property owners and those owners who said, I don't use that trail, go ahead, let it grow back. Staff helped with that. Whereas there were other people who wanted to maintain those access points into the park. So I guess to try and give some direction, I would add that decommissioning and not building out all the potential areas with trails is a value that I would support being in the zoning code as appropriate. Others? Oh, sorry.
Well, I was just gonna, I think it was Marie that suggested, kind of trying to classify and say, well, we can have maybe a trail width, for example, for exterior. Again, I think of Pioneer Park. And, on the outside that, where a lot of people, and then if you go interior, generally that you would think those would be much, much smaller as a way to, I'm not necessarily solve the problem, but at least think about it. Cause I think as I tried it, I think, and Don and others have kind of brought this up, there's a myriad kinds of things, and how do you try to simplify it, and trying to fit everything into one box, if you will, I think is going to be very difficult. And that might be one way to attack it.
I see Trustee Bearseth, and then I also see that Director Daly has a hand up. So please go ahead, Carolyn.
Yeah, it just, it occurred to me, I think, coming along the same line as the chair, in that I think that I think we want to avoid micromanaging. Because I think that a number of these decisions in the past have been made, with a lot of practical thoughts in mind. And maybe what we ought to be thinking is, rather than having a series of rules, maybe have, here's a series of priorities, or, this is the way that we'd like folks to approach. And, if you can't meet the goal that we might set as the highest goal, then, if there's some justification why you can move on to the other one. Because I think if we try to set up a series of very concrete rules about how we're going to approach this, we're going to leave a lot of decision-making. We're going to not permit folks who are building trails or maintaining trails to have some sense of flexibility that will be very practical, rather than, according to the law, so to speak.
I'm going to say, add one more comment from me, which we talked about dogs, we talked about bikes, we talked about scooters, and also in Pioneer Park, we know many of those trails support equestrian uses also. So I just wanted to put another use on the table. Are there other thoughts, or has staff gotten good direction?
I apologize. I had to step out to take a call. I presume you solved everything while I was out of the room. Nice work, everybody. Eileen, do you have what you and Carson need to maybe frame this up?
I think so, at least an initial stab, right? I mean, that's the beauty of this process, is we can bring back something and you guys can tinker with it until meets your vision.
Thank you. Trustee Bender.
Yeah, I just had one question because I think this may be an umbrella that we're kind of forgetting about, which is I would expect that the way this would be carried out is the way we've been managing Pioneer Park, which is if there's a project that needs to be done, the staff puts together a needs and a proposal, and it goes to the Open Space Trust Board, and we have a conversation. So that there is citizen input into the question of, for this particular project, is this sort of the highest and best way to achieve the objective? So, and as long as there's a function like that in place, I feel pretty comfortable with the concept of let's have an overall objective base as opposed to a prescription-based rule.
That's
I mean,
correct.
I assume, Jesse, that's what we're expecting to be the ultimate way this thing progresses.
Absolutely. And I will just note that this is the law now, though. So what we write, the Open Space Trust will not, if we propose restrictive code, you will not be able to approve something less restrictive. So you'll have an extra layer, if I'm making any sense at all, on no sleep. But I would presume the same processes, review process that you've employed over quite a many years would still play out.
And Trustee Ate.
Thank you, Jerry. I also wonder how much discretion we have with some of the decisions that are coming up, especially after looking at some of the sensitive habitat areas that Elaine was showing in her slideshow, because seemingly we would run into a lot of not necessarily barriers, but considerations with critical areas habitat, right, and regulations. So I wonder how much leeway we even have in the first place for some of these decisions.
That's a great comment. I will point out that our open spaces, in addition to this new open space zone, are also subject to critical areas regulations. Some of them are adjacent to shorelines, so you have shoreline lake regulations, and more. All of those are still in place, so they will work together. And that would inform all of our development projects and the proposals that are presented to the trust for Pioneer Park and Ingstrom. I hope that answers your question.
It does. I was just wondering, just for efficiency's sake and trying to go back to what people were talking about before, to streamline things, it seems like so many of these decisions are already addressed by the law anyway.
That is correct.
So thank you.
And Trustee Hildebrandt.
What I was trying to get at earlier, asking if there was already an existence trail construction guide, or was that it's perfectly acceptable in a statement of the law to delegate authority for certain processes to a position or an external document, and allow the maintenance and specification of that document to be developed separately. And there are so many considerations in how trails are constructed, as we saw in the slideshow, that it might be appropriate in this case to do just that.
Yeah, the zoning code may dictate, let's say the trail width is the easiest one for me to pick as an example, a trail width of 6 feet. And then the Pioneer Park Master Plan may prescribe a trail width of 5 feet. And we would assume that master plan would prevail, right? So we can get more restrictive as we go down the hierarchy, but we can't go the other direction. So the Pioneer Park Master Plan couldn't come back and say, nope, we need 8-foot trails. The zoning code only allows for 6. So that's what we're trying to guard against, is stay high enough that you've got sufficient restrictions that you feel good about the guidance, but you may, all of us through the course of the planning work we do, become more restrictive and specific based on the sites we're working in, if that helped.
Council member.
well, it seems to me that that speaks for the importance of flexibility in whether we just set objectives or we refer to a guide for construction. For example, if we say that in Pioneer Park, the trails are only supposed to be 8 feet, then do we have to restore the ones that are 25 feet wide? Have we just bought ourselves an expensive and maybe unaffordable kind of thing? Because they're as-built conditions, and there are going to be times when, from a construction perspective, you need to make something bigger or different from what a very prescriptive standard would say. And simply a look at the pictures that we saw that Elaine showed us demonstrate that. There are just so many conditions that I don't think we're all smart enough to figure out prescriptively what should be done. I think we can point to something that indicates what kinds, what the general standards are, but have some flexibility to vary them when we need to for construction things, or we decide we want to narrow the trails in the west thing of Pioneer Park, west portion of Pioneer Park, northwest rather.
So if we adopt a zoning code and we find in our open space system that we have areas that are not in compliance, those become non-conforming. They're allowed to continue in their existing state. Generally, they're allowed to be maintained. But when we go to replace them and substantially replace them, we have to come into compliance with the code. And that applies to all of the development regulations. I've probably oversimplified the non-conformance position, but that's generally how it works.
Are there any closing thoughts? Great.
Okay, thank you for that. We're going to move now back to the top of the document, Exhibit 1, the drafts open space zone. And again, I think now we're kind of going from that 30,000 foot level down to probably, 5,000 or less. We've got a draft statement for the purpose, which is the first one. Hopefully you've all had a chance to look at it. We also had some written comments. And I think what we'll do is we'll take written comments first, just to air those. And then if there are additional thoughts, we'll entertain those, and then we'll hopefully come up with a finished product and then just kind of move down the page. So on the purpose, I think I was the only one that provided written comments. And thank you for putting that up on the screen. I had a couple, first, in the first sentence there, I suggested maybe that a better term than restore would be to enhance. It's kind of more broad-based. Restore just says kind of go from -1 to 0, if 0 is kind of where you'd restore to, where enhance said, well, maybe there's things we can do that would get it to a +1. So that was my suggestion. That's kind of wordsmithing. But kind of more globally, I looked at the purpose, and I kind of see 4 benefits. Offer access to recreation, provide habitat, provide ecological services, and provide education and stewardship. And I looked at it, I'm suggesting that we just reorder these, and again, we'll let the staff kind of wordsmith on it, but I kind of thought that really offering access for recreation and relaxation should be the first one. And the way I thought about that is I said, well, if we looked at Pioneer Park and we put a big fence around it and said, no trails, we're not, you can look at it from afar, and we can provide for habitat inside, but you can't really get in there. I don't think that the community would be real excited about that. So that's why I thought really what we're looking at this open space is to do all 4 of these things, but I just thought that offering access being number 1 and then kind of going down the line there. So that was my thought there. Think about it if you have any good, bad, or different. Commissioner Cohen.
Yeah, I have 2 comments. I didn't write a comment. I didn't submit a comment on this, but I have the same feeling about using the word enhance, but I would just add that and not delete restore. So I would add that. I think that's consistent with something we talked about last time too. On your reordering model, I'm not sure I agree with that. because in a little different context, last time we talked about, okay, what should be at the top of this stuff? And at least there was some sentiment then that it's the environmental side of it, more than the recreation side of it, just to, cut it to the chase. So I'm not, it's not a major deal for me.
I agree.
But I don't want to lose sight of that, hierarchy of feeling, at least on some people's part.
Okay, thank you. Looking at the screen, any other thoughts?
Chair Struck, what I'm going to try to do, we talked a couple days ago about how challenging editing will be with this big of a group, but Carson has just dropped the word enhance, and I
Oh, I
think
see. Okay, thank you.
so you suggested adding it. I heard a suggestion.
Right.
I think if there's agreement for it, we could do a round of thumbs up. We'll leave it. We can move on. That process works.
Yeah,
Great.
well, thank you for that. I was going to see if anybody else had any thought, but so looking at the screen, where you see where enhanced is added there, everybody.
Yeah.
Seems to make a little more sense.
Okay.
I don't feel strong.
So preserve, protect, restore, and enhance. Okay. Everybody,
Mm-hmm.
thumbs up, good with that, I think. Not seeing any, okay. And then the second one is kind of the reordering. I made a suggestion, Commissioner Cohen kind of suggested, let's leave it as it is. Thumbs up for the change or not?
Well,
Who said well?
Uh,
Oh, sorry. Marie?
I don't, I mean, I agree with you. I would just reorder that sentence to put access to nature for passive recreation and relaxation ahead of provide educational and stewardship opportunities. I think that's just the right order of thinking about it.
Okay, so in that last sentence, then just say open space.
Right.
Offer access and then provide education, just flip those two.
So
Correct.
I think the
Okay.
sentence is open space lands also provide access to nature for passive recreation and relaxation
Right.
and educational and stewardship opportunities. Is that the flip?
Yeah.
Okay.
I guess my only comment would be, I would take the word also out. I don't, it's not additive to me. It's two separate things. We do the ecological stuff and we provide access to nature, and that also kind of diminishes in my mind the emphasis on access to nature.
So strike right after the words open space land, strike also.
Yeah.
Peter,
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
I had a question about, and maybe it's going to be deleted, but what passive recreation means. Does that mean people can't jog through those open space parks? Because there's considerable amount of that goes on at the present time.
We have a definition for that.
Pardon me?
We have a definition for that. Passive recreation is a term that's commonly used to distinguish from things like athletics and playgrounds and things like that. So on the screen there, Councilmember Jacobson, I'm not sure if you have that in front of you. We have the definition of passive recreational uses.
And that's why I asked the question.
Yeah.
Because I don't know what it means, and I don't know if passive recreation means you can't jog in one of those parks, because there are a lot of people that run through Pioneer Park.
No, you're allowed to jog. Hiking, jogging we can add that. Absolutely.
Well, I think the term is subject to any number of interpretations, and it's a bad thing to introduce something like that in here. So that's my view.
Elaine has a comment, staff comment.
This is just for the consideration, in terms of wording. I ran this by some of our natural resources staff also. I was interested in their feedback. There was a suggestion from one of our staff members that maybe the words human enrichment may be more appropriate than relaxation. I thought I would just put that out there. So you can shoot it down easily, but.
Maybe could you take it back to the purpose? Oh. Do we like to add jogging to the passive recreational uses?
Definition.
The definition, I mean.
I'd like to ask the council member, you were saying you didn't agree with having the term there because you found.
Well, if you want to add this, I think it broadens the definition appropriately, and it doesn't get us to a place where we have somebody saying, oh, neener, you're jogging, you can't do this. And we get into one of these little, childish backbiting things. So if you want to add that, I think that clarifies it.
Councilmember Reynolds.
Just a quick question. I want to confirm my understanding that passive recreation would not include bicycling or horseback riding. Is that correct? Because they certainly place more stress on the environment than the other things listed. I'm not going to mention an opinion because you should decide what you want.
Commissioner Cohen.
Well, this is the problem with the definition of passive recreation. And that's why I think I put on my comments here, I think that's an EPA definition. And it sort of works mechanically, but it seems kind of weird to define passive in terms of that there aren't any facilities needed, like no baseball, no backstop or anything like that. But I don't, and so there's something that distinguishes passive from active. And to me, it wasn't, if we're talking about the definition of passive recreational uses also, to me, it wasn't just simply the facilities presence or not, although I can't tell you that doesn't work for most things. But for example, you could jog and passive, and jogging would be included in this current definition of passive recreation. So I don't know. It just seemed like an odd definition. You could just, if you wanted, I don't have any problem with adding jogging, but it's the beginning sentence that I find a little bit odd to come right out of the box with. Okay, passive recreation means there's no baseball diamond here, or whatever it is.
That, I know we've jumped to the definition section, but that definition still works without that sentence, in my opinion.
Right. Paul.
And I just wanted to point out, I don't see that definition trying to be all inclusive. There are the words generally have a low impact and include activities such as. So it does allow for activities to be used or be enjoyed in the park that aren't necessarily listed. And I think the caveat we have to figure out is how do we, using a pun analogy, how do we fence around the activities so that there are not organized activities that destroy the park, that require additional equipment that would be contrary to the purpose of an open space. And I think what we have here, you can add stuff and take stuff out, but it's general enough, but specific enough, I think, to serve the purpose.
And just to add on to what you said, Paul, that last phrase, as a result, passive recreational uses are highly compatible with natural resource protection. So again, if you have an activity that would be destroying, if you will, or affecting natural resources, they would say, well, that's probably not considered passive.
If I can add something, I'll give an example. So jogging, absolutely allowable, but if someone were to organize a race and it was a color race where people were bombing people with color, that would not be in the spirit of what we're trying to do to maintain and enhance the natural habitat. So obviously that type of activity would not be allowed where jogging would be.
Commissioner Cohen.
My comments was, that I submitted was whether the word generally should be in there or not, because I looked up the definition and I believe that where this is taken from doesn't have the word generally. And I assume that that was put in there just to give a little more wiggle room in deciding what it was, but I was a little bit uncomfortable with the word generally. You know, passive recreational uses have a low impact on the facilities used, period. You know, et cetera. So I would personally delete generally. I think I would think about, either deleting the first sentence or moving it down somewhere. You know, because it distracted me to have it to be the first thing that came out of the box on how to define passive, you know.
So I think I would agree that the word generally could come out if you're looking for staff feedback here. I do like the words such as. Commissioner Burstein, or excuse me, Vice Chair Burstein pointed that means that sentence isn't all inclusive. And if you'd like to either strike or move that first sentence, I think that definition still works just fine with either of those options.
Yeah, I think we should just strike the first sentence. I don't feel like doing a definition that has to be defined by defining what something else is, feels like a strong way to do it.
Strike.
Chairman Struck,
Yeah,
if I might.
yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I agree with deleting the first sentence. I don't think it's necessary. The problem I agree with Dan Cohen about is that generally implies that there is exceptions to the rule, and I don't think there should be. I would change the word facilities used, because I don't think we're really, to me, facilities means something, a physical building or something. I think what we're talking about is low impact on the open space land, and it ought to say open space land. And there are, like everything else, there's exceptions to the rules. I'm generally opposed to bicycles, but I think it's appropriate for bicycles to be on the exterior ADA paths at Pioneer Park. They're very wide, they're hard, there's plenty of room to maneuver. So I don't have a problem with there being bicycles in the exterior. So maybe we need to say, have something in here that says, unless otherwise approved by the city, by the governing board, by somebody. But I think we'll have a community uproar if we try to outlaw bicycles on the exterior of Pioneer Park. And there's also that paved path along the west side of the Northeast, which, if I remember correctly, is paved because it's part of the safe trails, the safe paths to school system. And if I recall from that discussion, that's the reason it's paved, or at least one of the reasons why it's paved. But clearly we don't want to be excluding bicycles along that path. So we got to figure out some way to say there might be an exception and there needs to be a process for, you know, permitting that exception.
Chair Struck.
Oh,
Okay, I'm going to just mention something about definitions. I'd like to encourage you to keep the words facilities used in this definition. You know that there's a part 2 to this exercise. We'll be writing another zone, and this definition may show up again.
Okay.
So I would encourage us to keep it generic. Let's get the definition correct. It'll probably be used again. My interpretation of this list is it either allows or forbids biking, and it really leaves it open to individual park rules. Let's use equestrians. That's maybe a better example.
Mm-hmm.
Equestrians are only allowed in certain areas of our park system and open space system. We haven't listed equestrians here. So as we apply the rules to the properties, that allows us to make rules around equestrians for each property. So I would leave it out. I think putting it in implies that equestrians are allowed everywhere, equestrian use, and that's not the intent. So I would keep equestrians and bicycling out.
And I generally agree with that, except that I don't know how you then, through this definition, communicate that other uses can be provided for example, in the Pioneer Park Master Plan.
I understand what your objective is, but this is a zoning code, and we don't have to say things like that. It is understood and known that there is a hierarchy of regulations. This is zoning. There are park rules which are separate. There are regulations, open space trust that has separate. So we do not need to put those caveats in this zoning code.
Okay, so then how does one acquire the understanding that there is a hierarchy?
Well, when you arrive at Pioneer Park to use the facility, there are rules displayed there about the proper use of that facility, which are distinctly different from the rules when you arrive at another facility.
Okay.
Councilmember Jacobson.
If we're going to do that, shouldn't we think about adding something saying, uh, except where otherwise permitted? Because there might be some place that you could have equestrian stuff and you would say horses and their, what they bring with them are permitted, or bikes. And, that would solve the problem about bikes being able to use that, the paved path on the east side of Island Crest Way, on the west side of the northeast quadrant.
Councilmember Reynolds.
Just a thought that I understand what the city manager is saying about the hierarchy, and I absolutely agree with her on that. I worry a little bit about biking and equestrian because a future city staff might argue that those are not low impact. So because they certainly are higher impact than pedestrians. So I wonder if those two, because they're so extensively done in the park system now, if there should be a conscious decision on them. But then more generally to the question about should it be some places and others, I think you're going to tie yourself up in knots if you try to write zoning code that says in certain parts of the zone it's okay, in others it's not. I think you have to say if it's going to be allowed anywhere, we should list it and then rely on the city manager and her capable team to figure out where with appropriate input from you guys.
If I may respond, I guess what I'm struggling with that comment is the definition of passive recreational uses is not intended to be all inclusive. And I think if we intended that, we would still not get it quite right. And we are in the definition section. I want to point out. I'm not sure what to do on the fly tonight. I think we have differing opinions on this. Maybe we ended up down in the definition section. Might I advise we go back to the top and work our way through it and see if there's another way.
Right, let's go back to the purpose. I think we were almost done with that. So the two changes, I believe, were in the first sentence to add the word enhance. And then in the second sentence, it was just to flip around as it's shown up there to include the passive recreation and relaxation. And I guess I think it was Elaine that suggested maybe rather than relaxation, it was human enrichment was, and maybe that do people have a strong feeling about switching relaxation or putting in human enrichment versus relaxation? Good, bad, or indifferent? Commissioner Cohen.
I understand the reasoning behind it, but what one person views as enriching is not what another person might, but passive, however defined, is a little more a common, lower common denominator, I think. No offense. Oh, she's not here. Forget, let me take that.
You can offend her all you want. She's out of the room.
All right. Any other thoughts on that? So thumbs,
Question.
oh, sorry, Jody.
Sorry, I was gonna agree with Dawn. I like what Elaine said, but I think that relaxation is probably more appropriate here.
Okay. Thumbs up if we just keep relaxation. All right. We're good on that then. All right. Okay. Last call for anything on the purpose. Marie? No, I don't. Okay, we're good. All right. So moving to B, which is open space zone designation requirements. And you can see we've got 3 there. Again, looking at the written comments, Don, maybe I'll start with your comment. We'll kind of work backward.
I just didn't know. I assume that it is correct that the open space lands that we have now are primarily native vegetation and natural features. I just didn't, I raised the idea of what happens when you bring in conifers that are more heat tolerant or drought tolerant, and which is what some of the people have been promoting. I'm not denigrating that, but is that no longer native, or maybe I'm just nitpicking though?
Actually, you're not. And Elaine, you walked in right at the perfect time. Also, Commissioner Cohen was saying bad things about you a moment ago. So no, I'm
It's
just
on the
kidding.
record.
I'm just kidding. We're having some fun. So Elaine, if I can point you to section B, open space designation requirements, where it says a largely undeveloped state primarily composed of native vegetation and other natural features, or the ability to be restored as such. I think the comment was, what do we think about that? Our definition of native vegetation is evolving.
It really is. Native is a circle that can be wider and wider and narrower and narrower. It's changing. And then as we are thinking about what our forests look like 50 years down the road in light of warming climate, that also changes a little bit. The way that this is worded right now doesn't give me heartburn, because it says primarily composed of native vegetation. That still is our guiding principle. It doesn't say exclusively, and I'm sorry that I missed some of the conversation around this, but the way that it's worded right now, I think fits well with the way that we manage our open spaces.
I think the staff are okay with it, but if the commissions would like us to.
That's okay with me. If staff's okay with it on that one, that's okay with me.
Palm trees everywhere.
That's sort of like,
Yeah.
no, that's what it's for the wireless facilities, make them look like palm trees.
Sorry.
Native to North America. Yeah.
Okay, so Jody.
I just wanted to say I support Rory's suggestion about changing ability to potential. I like that idea. How does anybody else?
I was
feel
just
about
getting
that?
there.
Okay.
Okay, so in number 2, at least in terms of written comments, there's 2 suggestions. The first one is right at the beginning of the sentence. I thought if we should add the word to be, so to be in a largely, just you put a verb in there like the other 2 have. Just I think it reads better. And then Rory had his suggestion in the second part of the sentence there of changing the word ability and using potential, which he says he believes was used in the staff report. So for ability there.
Rory gets a gets a win here for reading the staff report, so we must do. So we're
those are
looking for the word, Carson, B2, second line, the word ability, strike it for the word potential. Or the, yep, right
yeah.
there. Chair Struck, did we get the change at this
Yeah.
beginning of the
So
sentence?
the revised sentence, to be in a largely undeveloped state, primarily composed of native vegetation and other natural features, or the potential to be restored to such. Everybody good with that?
Marie has her hand up.
Oh, Marie, thank you. Marie.
Yeah, I agree with those changes. I had a separate comment and question. It begins with, in addition to the requirements established in chapter 19.15 of the code. I went to look at that code and I had a hard time connecting what in chapter 1915 is a requirement for what we're talking about here. The only commission discussed in that part of the code is the design commission. So I was hoping to get a little color on what that means. Maybe that first, and then I have a comment.
I think we may have lost Allison Van Gorp. She had to leave early. She is here from the planning department. I'm gonna need. Eileen, do you have, that's our land use code.
I had the same confusion that Marie did, although I didn't focus on the design commission, but I didn't quite understand the linkage there either. It was a very detailed section.
I am also, at this point, I'm also a little perplexed. I'm wondering if maybe we have the wrong chapter. I think that's something that staff will have to look into and come back to at the next meeting, but if there's three of us that are confused, we'll certainly look into it.
We will add that to our list to follow up.
Yeah,
Thank
thank
you
you for that.
Okay, and then my comment was, I think there needs to be some linkage between item number 3 and the purpose. It seems like those two things are overlapping, but not identical, where they really ought to be identical.
So the purpose of section B is a little bit different. It's actually just defining the parcels that get rezoned and how we determine that. I suppose, to Marie's point, Eileen, I mean, number 2 or 3 could be struck, honestly, and just, we could keep number 1. It just says, how do we determine which properties belong in the zone? And the purpose statement says what those properties do. I'm looking at, as I'm legally opining, do you have thoughts or?
No, I mean, I think for the designation requirements that, it's going to be up to the will of the group. Item 3, I mean, gets at the purpose of the open space zone, which we've established in the subsection A just above this. So I think at the pleasure of the groups, you could take it or leave it. It's not, I don't think it's required to make sense of what is required for a particular parcel or parcels to be located or not within this particular zoning designation.
Mr. Cohen.
Yeah, I'm okay with the way that it is. I would leave 3 in if we wanted to do something in line with Marie's suggestion. You could add at the end of 3, consistent with the purpose set forth in section A.
Section B too, just, I mentioned before, zoning is active. So as the zoning code gets adopted and future councils are evaluating properties that may fit within the zone, the staff and then the planning commission and the council would be looking at B and going through criteria 1, 2, and 3 to make sure those potential properties meet those requirements. So after I just said you could take that out, I might suggest you leave it in and for that purpose.
Okay, trustee Hildebrand.
I'm going to springboard off of that description of how the admission of parcels into a certain zone is up to acts of the city council over time. And I mentioned last time that I didn't think that it should be a requirement for the city to own, lease, or manage a parcel in order for it to be considered open space or to be admitted into the zone of open space. And gave an example of something that was planned to be acquired by the city, but was first to be zoned as open space before the city acquired it for some reason. I think that this is overly restrictive, and the explanation that was given in the overview in our packet was that we wanted to restrict the parcels that were considered for initial admission into the open space zone. But definition of the zone is independent of that action, and I'd like it to be considered in that way. So if we could get an explanation of why it seems important to otherwise limit the lands that should be admitted into the open space zone to be those that are owned, managed, or leased by the city, then I'd like to hear that.
I'd be happy to respond to that. When the city council docketed this work item, it was based on public properties only. So we set forth a work path that included consideration of rezoning public lands. They did not include in their scope consideration of private lands. If the trust and the commission feel that that should be a strong consideration, I would encourage you to put that in your handoff memo for consideration of a future work item. The reason I'm advising against it right now is those are private property owners that have not been engaged at all at this point. Now, I think what you're saying is like, just put it in the definition now. It is outside the scope of work. So if we put it in here, I would not be comfortable mapping any private lands because we have had zero public process or engagement with any of those property owners. But I think what you're describing is, and I'm not here to speak for the council, I think the council would be open to considering that evolution of this code. But when we rezone privately owned properties, there's a very robust process and conversation that happens, and it just has not occurred. This has all been public lands focused. And you have two council members here who can speak on behalf of themselves and their opinion as well as whether or not that would be a future work item.
Councilmember Reynolds.
I agree with the city manager on what scope is now. I agree it's a topic worth of broader discussion at the council. I was just stepping back also. I thought Trustee Bender had a very important comment about consistency of these two sections. And with that in mind, I wonder if you could just take B, strike 2 and 3 entirely, and just say open space lands must meet the designation requirements to qualify for classification as open space, must be owned or leased and managed by the city of Mercer Island, and fulfill the purpose statement above, or act to fulfill or support fulfillment of, or something like that. And that way, because otherwise 2 and 3 essentially duplicate what's in A.
I think that's a good suggestion, and I would concur with it. I don't think we really considered as a council the possibility that somebody would be donating land or that we would spend money to acquire. But I think Councilmember Reynolds' suggestion here is a good one, and if I decide I want them to manage my property, I got to deal with the city, and then it can be an open space. Or if I want to give it to the city, it owns it. If I want to lease it, so I think that covers the waterfront in a kind of way that's simple. And the simpler the code is, the better, I think, in general terms.
So what does the commissioners and trustees think about, again, striking 2 and 3, and then just expanding 1 to say owned, leased, or managed by the city, and then just, I don't have exact words, but then kind of just restating that it would, fulfill the purpose, one or all of the purposes therein, and just leave it at that.
it would be something like in alignment with,
Yeah.
what you said it better than I did, in alignment with the purpose statement above or
As
in
if acts
section
to
one.
fulfill the purpose or something.
Acts to fulfill the
I would be happy to delegate that wording to you
Yeah.
and the
Yeah,
team,
exactly.
but
Yeah.
that idea.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll scratch something on the screen here and then we'll
Yeah.
make it read better when it
Yeah.
comes back.
So, thumbs up of striking 2 and 3 and doing the revision on 1 there. Okay. All right. So that takes care of open space. I had a couple other comments.
Chair Struck, the attorney is waving her hand at
Oh, I'm sorry.
us.
Well, and actually, I have a message from Allison Van Gorp from the planning department. Just wanted to loop back to the 19.15 reference that was kind of throwing us all for a loop. That is a process chapter and it really should be 1915-240 because that is the section that governs rezones. And so that was the idea, was to pull in, because if you're going to rezone property, the code says you have to meet A, B, C, D, E, or F, that kind of thing. So that should be what is there, and we can just add that, and that should hopefully clarify questions about what we were getting at.
So it's 19.15.240.
Okay, thank you for that. Okay, we're going to move on to section C, uses permitted, and I will ask
Gavel.
the co-chair to take.
Great. So I would find it useful if I may just read through this quickly and then we can turn to the written comments and spoken comments, but uses permitted. The following land uses are permitted in the open space zone. A use not permitted by this section is prohibited. 1, passive recreation uses. 2, passive recreational amenities. 3, public parking. 4, temporary uses compatible with the purpose of the open space zone is authorized by the city manager or designee. 5, public art. 6, wireless communication facilities, as noted there. 7, utilities, and 8, habitat restoration. So, questions or clarifications before we get started with? Great, Miss Trustee Olson.
Oh. I thought it was interesting trails weren't included. I mean, is this one of those sections where we're gonna overthink it and put too many things in there, or I don't know. I just thought it was odd that the trails weren't in there.
That can be added fairly simply. It probably also lives somewhere in that favorite definition that we were just batting around, the use anyway. If that would, go ahead.
It does live in the definition section. Passive recreational amenities include structures, pieces of equipment, developments specifically provided for passive recreational uses such as signs, trails, restrooms, kiosks, benches, etc.
Okay.
Eileen, do you have any objection if trails gets added to this list anyway, just because that's mostly what's going on in open space zones?
It's redundant, but I don't think it's legally problematic.
If you'd like to add trails to the list, that's certainly appropriate.
Councilmember Jacobson.
I have a question about parking, and I would, because I don't know that we want to have parking in open space zones except in areas adjacent to the open space zones. And because I can't think of any place that, except perhaps for Luther Burbank Park, but there's parking lots and things of that sort. But to suggest that we're gonna, that'd be okay to have parking in a open space zone, I don't think the public would be wild about that, to be honest with you.
Actually, I agree with you on that. And it's listed here and then in the following section is where we spell out the restrictions related to that use. So we'll be getting to that in the next section. So the trick here is if it's something that's allowed in the zone, it needs to be on the list. And then in this next section is, we'll probably spend most of the rest of our time in this meeting is regulating those uses. Where do we need to provide more specificity about that specific use? And parking is something that we did take a stab at in that next section.
Trustee Hildebrandt.
Yes, so I think we should take care of this, closing out this list before we move on to the next section. I had an idea regarding parking, which is that there are ample rights of way that are adjacent to the larger parcels that are currently considered to be open space, and that parking facilities could be constructed within the existing right of way without impacting any of the actual land that is incorporated in the parcels that make up the open space. So I guess my suggestion is that we remove parking as a permitted use of open space, but consider using the right of way that already exists and making accommodations as needed for parking, putting up barriers and all of the visual barriers and so on, those accommodations, but not actually impact the open space. So
It might be helpful if we could, I think we ran through this at the last meeting, if you don't mind, if I just have Elaine remind us of where we have existing parking on property versus right away, and we do have both.
Little tricky for me to answer offhand. I haven't looked exactly at where the property lines are for all of these open spaces, but I would say maybe the majority of the ones that we're talking about for this zone, there is off-street parking, which I believe probably infringes on the actual property boundary of the open space. Examples are areas like along Southeast 53rd Place. And it may even be true along East Mercer Way, where it is next to Angstrom Open Space, Southeast 53rd, and Parkwood Ridge. So I would want to look at that pretty carefully, because I think we could potentially get into a situation where we have existing parking that would be non-conforming.
I saw on the screen Commissioner Hay. That's a question.
Yeah, I agree with the comments to just remove this as a permitted use. Between last meeting and this meeting, and then seeing the paragraph about parking, number of parking spots per acres and that type of thing. I think it's really hard to come up with the exact number of spaces we would need, and that still doesn't guarantee that there's going to be parking for everybody who wants it, or that that parking will be used for the open space and not something else. So I think I'm really in favor of just removing this as an allowed use.
I do want to clarify if the recommendation is to remove public parking, we would still be in a position to provide accessible parking at a number of the facilities. And that's not something that you would be able to prohibit.
City Manager, just to follow up on the ADA, I fully understand what you're saying, but would the proposed minimum standards and so forth then apply? Is saying, well, if the park is under 15 acres, there would be no parking, period? Or or we say, well, if we could somehow sandwich one in for ADA, we could do it, or I'm just trying to understand the.
And American Disabilities Act is more gray than that. In many ways, it says if the facility may be accessible, thou shall make accommodations when improving it to do so. If we're talking about an open space area with steep grades and no possibility of accessibility, I would not be in a position to put in an ADA parking spot. Pioneer Park is a good example of an open space that potentially has, it does have accessible trails. And at some point, we maybe need to put accessible parking adjacent to that facility. So we evaluate accessibility on a case by case, site by site, and even like sub-site design.
So if I understand right, then, so whether we include public parking in or out of as a permitted use, ADA would still take precedent in that regard, so it doesn't really matter.
Peter? Why don't we just say in number 4, if the city is stuck on having public parking, just say ADA accessible parking where practicable.
Yeah, that works for me.
Bernstein. Commissioner Bernstein.
There we go. I would be very concerned about just striking that before we understand the inventory of current parking that may be outside of the right of way. Because taking out the parking that exists today for those spaces that are heavily used, I think would receive a very negative impact around the community.
Trustee Bender.
Yeah, I mean, this is a topic that's difficult, but I took a look at what the proposed description of the development standard is. And Pioneer Park already, they would put 7.5 parking spaces in Pioneer Park plus 1 more in Engstrom. Well, we already have more than that at Pioneer Park. And other than that, it would put 1 parking space at Gallagher Hill, 1 parking space at Mercerdale Hillside, and 2 at Upper Luther Burbank, which I think is a mistake in all those cases because Gallagher Hill, I'm not sure how to deal with that one. But Mercerdale and Luther Burbank are adjacent to parks with a capital P that have parking already in them. And I think the priority when it comes to open space lands is there should never be parking when there is an adjacent street that provides parking, or there is a public park that provides parking, which obviates the need for parking specific to the open space. So that's one problem I have with this design standard. The other is, I think ADA is a difficult conversation in the context of open space because many of these places are really not accessible to people with ADA needs. But I also very much support trying to get as many people who have ADA needs into our open spaces. So let's make sure we figure out how to get them there. But when you're going to provide this limited number of parking spaces, for example, Gallagher Hill would have 1 parking space. I have difficulty prioritizing ADA over everybody else. And I don't know how you reconcile all of those difficulties. So unfortunately, I'm doing what I don't like doing, which is pose a problem but not have an answer.
Staff want to respond or should we go on?
You could keep going. I don't have a response.
May I just say quickly, I have a question about park maintenance vehicles and how that fits into this need. And I wonder if staff has a.
Sam, what do you do when your crews go to a spot that doesn't have any parking?
Well, we have, we're usually able to get in with equipment or vehicles. We have smaller vehicles, little golf cart style vehicles, or come in by foot. If we have to park on a road or something, we can turn off and use flashers and whatnot. Does that answer your question, or do you have anything more specific?
Commissioner Khan.
I guess what I'm hearing is that the ADA is taken care of. Nobody has to decide yes or no on that. The law is telling us what we have to do or don't have to do. The existing cutouts of spaces, I think the city manager said those would be non-conforming uses, so the city isn't going to go in and suddenly plant shrubbery on those or anything like that. I think this may be a problem that doesn't need solving. And so to me, I'm coming around to deleting public parking here at this place. And that seemed to me to be a hot button almost as much as public transit stops were. So.
Commissioner.
Thank you. Something that I was thinking is, could we put a qualifier and have it be minimal public parking instead of completely striking it out, just allowing for it, but qualifying it so that it's understood that we're not going to be building massive parking lots at the open space areas.
That the addition of that word, it would work for us. And I'll remind you that the application of parking in the next section is really heavily restricted. But it's really up to you, your recommendation.
Thank you. All right. Tom.
For context, the existing rights of way within the city are quite generous. And so, for example, all of the parking that currently exists adjacent to the southeast quadrant of Pioneer Park is within the right of way. And I believe that the spaces that exist on the north side of Southeast 68th Street in the northeast quadrant are also within the public right of way. And I didn't complete my study, but I was doing an ad hoc study of the listed open spaces in Exhibit B and determining if there would be sufficient parking within the existing public right of way. And I came up with at least 50% of the listed areas have at least some adjacent right of way where parking would be available. So taking that into consideration, I would still strongly support the idea of striking the public parking as our permitted use.
May I ask a quick question of our attorney? Eileen, if parking is taken out, meaning there's no regulations guiding how parking would be constructed for ADA parking, you see where I'm going with this? I know often like these regulations, if we're going to put in an ADA spot because something is, we have an accessible trail and we can fit it, that these regulations there may be still some wiggle room there, right? We may need to research the
Yeah.
ADA piece a bit more before the next meeting, so.
This is just something I certainly don't know at the top of my head, because we have to look at basically like the preemption issues, right? Which is what you were alluding to earlier, but we can certainly look into that.
I see trustee Bender has her hand up, and then I would propose a thumbs up vote on this parking part of it, and then we should address the other, if there's any conversation on other uses. Marie?
Yeah, thank you. So could we just get a little bit more clarity from the city also on the sort of existing parking? I mean, I understand what Tom is saying, but I don't really myself understand whether people parking on Island Crest Way to access either the northeast or the southeast are parking in a right of way or parking in the park. We all on the trust board will remember that over on, I guess it's 68th, where all those markers have now been put up. That was a result of the board sort of rethinking how parking was happening there, and it was encroaching more and more on the park, but there was plenty of adjacent street parking, so we put up a sort of a visual barrier to make people park on the street instead of in the park. I think it would help to understand where we're talking about a street or non-park property, shall I say, where people are parking and where people are parking in the park. And the other comment I have is, we all know that there's parking going on, but none of it is designated as parking. It's just happening ad hoc. So I don't know how that gets defined as, you know, approved parking because it already exists, because it's really not designated as parking. So that's just more information I'd like to have before we sort of decide finally what we're going to do about parking.
So how about this? Why don't we put into your staff report next Friday when we publish an inventory of, that's probably too strong a word, a report out on just the parking activity associated with the various open space properties. And what we'll also attempt to do is by the next time we see you, have a photo tour as well, similar to what we did with the trails. You can see the activity that's happening. And it's up to you this evening if you just want to leave parking as pending, if you want to take it out, however you want to proceed, but we'll follow up with those items.
All right, I would propose we leave this as pending for staff additional information. I'd like to draw our attention to the couple of comments that were submitted, and the bottom three on page 1 were by Don Cohn. So Commissioner Cohn, would you like to address what you submitted in writing, or?
Still on parking or?
Nope, C5, C6, C7.
Problems using these microphones. Okay. Well, the public art one, I was just parroting what the city manager said, that we still need to talk about that. You wanted me to go on to my other ones were pretty small, but on wireless facilities. Again, I couldn't understand it very well, but I understand the preemption issues with the law. But I thought if it was legally permissible to start that with only if otherwise permitted, by just to strengthen a little bit the that it's not something that we're gonna just do willy-nilly. And then on C7, this was picking up on some examples that staff gave the last time about public safety or steep slope erosion and things like that. And I was trying to meet the objection that some people in the public made to just having, you're going to put utilities in there. And so I was trying to limit it in some way to public safety or protection of the natural environment. And there isn't a good alternative. So that was where I was trying to go on those.
Thank you for putting those on the table. Are there other comments about these new 9 setting parking aside?
Maybe, could we come back to public art and let's go take these maybe in the order they're a little easier. C6, Eileen, the recommendation is wireless communication facilities, adding the word only if otherwise permitted.
Absolutely fine. I read it as implied, but that's, I think, a good clarification edit. I think, yeah, I'll leave it there.
We can fix that up if there's agreement there.
Thumbs up.
Thank you for that. C7, this would be expanded to read utilities, but only where necessary for public safety or protection of the natural environment, and no reasonable alternative location exists. I am supportive of that language, provided the staff can take time between now and the next meeting and just review it and make sure that that totally works, but I think thematically that works for us. Yeah. Yes, okay.
Yep, yep.
Thumbs up.
All right, back to public art. You guys tied on this one.
Do I see hands? Oh, thank you, yeah. Great, let's start with Ashley. Thank you.
Yeah, my comment is about utilities. On the previous parks zone draft, we said the utilities would be underground whenever feasible. Is that reasonable to add to this? Do we need to state that, or would it not really apply given the type of utilities we would have in open space?
I think that would be, we can add that to the list, Commissioner Hay. I think that, so I heard utilities would be underground or feasible. Is that correct?
Mhm.
There's agreement. Again, we'll work on that language. Okay, yep. You all still aren't talking about public art.
Think of it. Okay,
Just,
Commissioner Coe.
just to get the ball rolling a little bit.
Well.
I sort of have a feeling that open space areas, for the most part, are not appropriate places for public art. And there are other places that we can do it. And maybe some of the limitations that we saw in some of the other, in some of the comments would make sense, or about the indigenous history and so forth. But I mean, there are some places that, I mean, you know, we're gonna have signs, we're gonna have this, we're gonna have this, we're gonna have that. And I don't think these places are appropriate as art galleries.
Oh, thank you. I'm not seeing this well. So let's start with trustee Hildebrandt and then trustee Bender.
Yes. Also, if we want to draw a line, between signage for informational purposes versus, ones that may be, fall more under First Amendment rights. If we start to allow public art, then, it's more of a free expression thing, and then you could, more reasonably run afoul of, First Amendment, considerations.
Okay, thank you. Trustee Bender?
I guess I'm becoming more of the opinion that public art is probably not a necessary thing in an open space zone. I do love the mythic bird. I think it draws people into Pioneer Park because of its location opposite the shopping center and the proximity of a picnic table, but I'm not sure that's a good enough reason to say, let's put some more in some other places. And the concept of art as cultural and historical references, I think that can be encompassed in the concept of, education. So I don't think we need to have public art be defined as something with cultural overlays. So I don't know. I guess on balance, if other people are feeling like public art is not something we ought to put in open spaces, I would be okay with that. If we did put it in, I think it needs to be restricted to public facing, so out on the outside borders of an open space. And obviously made of materials that are compatible with the open space environment. So, my 2 cents.
Commissioner Bernstein, Vice Chair.
So I'll speak in favor of art. I agree with trustee Bender that having it on the exterior public facing areas totally appropriate. I also want to point out that if we include art, it doesn't mean that suddenly art is going to spring up everywhere within the parks. So that has to go through an extensive process through the Arts Commission and the city council to be approved and placed in the location and accepted to the city to maintain that art. But I do think that there are opportunities for artistic expression in a natural environment that will enhance the overall park system as long as it's managed appropriately. And that's exactly why we have these other groups and commissions to help manage that ongoing.
Councilmember.
Well, I think you begin to start inviting First Amendment problems because you say, well, it can only be native materials. And somebody's going to say, well, wait a minute, I want to have 10 by, I want to have something. And the fact that there are two commissions that look at it don't make that problem any easier. We were talking about what kinds of signs you could have and everything else. I don't see that there's anything that really avoids a First Amendment problem when you start looking at it. You say, well, this is too bizarre. Well, that's, I think that raises those kinds of issues and there are plenty of places to put public art on this island. And we have one going on the freeway on West Mercer and everything. And so that it's not as if we're consigning no public art. I'd be for eliminating it.
So wouldn't those same First Amendment right issues apply to all the other places where you're installing public art?
They may.
So in that case, taking that further, you would eliminate art because of the risk of First Amendment
No, you wouldn't.
issues.
You deal with each one of those situations as you went, and what might be appropriate, a garish painting or something downtown or on a freeway entrance, might not be appropriate in a park. And we spend a lot of time saying we don't want to have a lot of wayfinding. We don't want to have a lot of stuff. We want this to be different. It's a nature thing. You go out into the park and there are trees and there are trails and there are squirrels and it's a different experience.
So, and within the open space parks now, there are only 2 art installations that I'm aware of. Is that correct? Everybody know?
Wildwood.
Wildwood has more,
No, it doesn't come up.
has 1.
Doesn't. Where's that private land?
I don't recall, might have to look at our story map that shows has like an inventory on the website. I can look at that right now.
So, and again, I'm not proposing that every square inch is dotted with art installations. If we're dealing with, in my mind, there are 2 existing, maybe there are a few more. There may come an occasion where there is an artist that has a very well expressed opportunity within the parks to put an installation in there that's accepted by the council, by the commission, that is not garish, and that extends the beauty of the park from an artistic standpoint. I still think that's an important place in our community. And I would rather see some ability for art to be accepted in the parks, highly restricted.
So what I hear you suggesting would be leave it on the list here and then put more boundaries on it on the next section?
Correct.
Do we want to do a thumbs up at this point? All right. So please thumbs up if you would like, I'm going to go with Paul's situation, if you'd like to leave it on the list. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And how are the remote people participating?
I'll vote.
Thumbs up.
This is Marie. I had my hand up. I'd like to see more language.
All right. So
Me too. Thank you.
Ashley, where are you?
I'm a no to public art. I think it should be removed. But if we do include it, I would like to see more described below, but I would prefer to remove it.
Hillary, yeah, we got Hillary in our count. So it's 7,
Okay. Mhm.
is that a half or is that a? Raven, what's our total tonight? 3, 4, 5, 6, 7.
Well, how about this?
11,
6,
12,
I
13. It is 7 to 6.
7, 6.
We would be happy to make an attempt at adding some language that ensures public art is in alignment with the purpose of open space. When we see you next time, you'll have a joint meeting. I haven't quite figured out how we're going to do this. We'll actually need you voting. So that may put to bed this public art discussion that has you split. Let us take a stab at revised language and then you can make a final call at the next meeting.
Thank you. Are there any other issues? Are we done with section C? And move on to the,
Well, I'm looking at the clock at 7, almost 7:30. So we've been at this for 2.5 hours. So I suggest that we take a 10-minute break. So I show 7:27. So 7:37, we'll reconvene. Thank you very much. All right, welcome back. So we're on to the open space zone development standards section in Exhibit 1. And we've got some written comments. Just to kind of overview, we've got applicability, setbacks, restrooms, parking, we've already talked a little bit about. We're kind of going to push that to next time. And then at the bottom, E and F, signs and kiosks and trail standards, we've already talked about. So really in this section, we really just have setbacks and restrooms. So with the subject of setbacks, you can see there we've got kind of 3 standards, minimum setbacks, how they're measured from the adjacent property line, and some exemptions there under number 3. And I'm looking, and there's a couple of us, myself, I believe, and Rory also questioned about the just having a single setback, minimum setback of 20 feet. And I don't know if staff wanted to comment on that or any thoughts on that first before.
I just took a bite of pizza. There you go. We're getting rummy. I believe, and Allison, is Allison Van Gorp, she had to leave the meeting, right? I believe the zoning language is consistent with other zones, but I would definitely want somebody that works this code regularly to be able to answer that question. If the preference is something more standard, like 20 feet, I would be happy to look into that and come back to you. I'm running quickly through my head of where we might have non-conforming uses as a result of that. But I'm not thinking of anything off the top of my head at the moment.
Well, let me ask the trustees and commissioners, I mean, do you have a strong feeling whether the proposed is 0 if it's adjacent to particular zones and 20 feet if it's adjacent to other zones? I see.
I'm afraid that I need a definition of setback so that I can render an opinion on this.
Actually, you know what? I'm just realizing this is where we could have used a lane. We have trails that run on property lines. That's the issue here. Eileen, you've had more sleep than me. Can you explain what a setback is?
This is a non-technical definition, but it's generally just an area that's preserved from development. If you think about your houses, right? You don't necessarily want, I don't know, something right up on the lot line to your property. It gives a little bit of spacing between adjacent properties.
So in open space, there has to be a certain amount of open space.
I like the definition. So I do believe where we took this language from was from the old Parks Code, just that draft. I think just as a starting place, it was as good a starting place as any, but it was just that a starting place.
So the thing that I would want to do between now and the next meeting is I think 20 feet is reasonable for open space, if that's the pleasure of the group. I want to ask, and we'll follow up and we'll put this in the staff report. I'll have Sam and Elaine help us identify where we may end up with non-conforming trail uses. That would be my main concern, but a non-conforming trail is not the end of the world. It just means if we go to replace it, it has to be pulled 20 feet back from the lot line.
Okay, Councilmember Reynolds.
Just a quick question. I was puzzled, as trustee Hildebrand was, by this for a moment, but setbacks to me make sense for buildings. Like maybe you don't want a restroom built right next to the edge of the property, but is there a way to make a setback not applicable to trails and just say for construction as opposed to development?
We could write that code language, I believe, and exempt trails if that's the preference. Again, sometimes trails end up right next to property lines for reasons of constructability, not because we prefer to put trails on the lot line.
Trustee Bender?
Thank you. I had a difficulty, if I was a property owner, I would have difficulty with the exemptions in number 3. I mean, I don't think I would be happy with a picnic table on my property line or a trail on my property line.
There it is right there, the exemption.
Right. I mean, landscape, or for sure, I wouldn't want parking areas. And I think given that it's a 0 setback for basically public zones, we should be able to figure out how to deal with things like picnic tables and trails, stuff like that. I'm not sure how you put a gate on a property line. So I'm a little confused by the exemptions that were included in section 3.
Thank you for flagging section 3. I apologize. That is where we included items that we know in our park system may currently sit on or immediately adjacent to a property line. I think picnic tables can probably come out. I would encourage you to keep fences, culverts, and landscaping at a minimum. Excuse me. And then, the parking areas, I think we need to come back and talk about if they're not on your property line, then they may be more central to your property, and it just depends on the property we're considering.
Okay. Trustee Effie.
Hi, just to pick up on that, I am a person who has a trail right on the property line of my house and an open space. And frankly, I think that, just speaking from my perspective, if you're going to buy a property that's next to an open space, that's just kind of part of the deal. But at the same time, I can see how maybe you would prefer for new construction not to be built in terms of a building, or like you were saying, Jesse, a lot, or as Marie was saying, a picnic table, like some kind of structure where people would be stagnant. But if you live next to an open space, then, I mean, frankly, you're living next to a park because you chose to live next to a park. And so there's going to be activity in the park. And I think that's part of the environs of your choice. So I wonder if the trails can somehow be disentangled from the structural language.
So I committed a moment ago before I clicked on and realized we had put trails in section 3. I would still be happy to get back to you and include in our staff report kind of a scan of the properties we have and where we might have trails on property lines, just for your awareness before you make a final decision on this section of code.
Yeah, I just wonder if trails should be in the same developments as other developments where people are actually being still as opposed to moving on through. Because I think it presents a different disruption or degree of disruption to a homeowner potentially.
Okay, thank you. Sam?
Yeah, could I just provide a little bit of context or just zoom out a little bit? We do have several, it's not mentioned in this area, but we do have several right-of-way trails that are very thin, you know, right-of-way parcels that connect neighborhoods and things. And in those cases, those trails are on property lines. Also, we have some thin open space properties. So 47th Street open space, though not really developed with trails, it's only about 50 feet wide. So at some point, if that did have trails, then you would run out of room pretty quick if we got rid of the number 3 exemption. And just there's some weird shaped parcels that are kind of puzzle pieced together.
Oh yeah, I totally agree with you, Sam. And I think it's actually part of what makes living next to an open space so beautiful, right? Is that you do have these right-of-way trails right on next to the property lines, and people are outside enjoying these spaces all the time. And then you bring up the logistical concern too, right? A lot of these, you know, places like Ellis Pond and other small open spaces are throughways to neighborhoods, and it connects people. So I think it's actually a great thing, as opposed to the concern with some of the more kind of NIMBYism that might influence people not wanting fences or infrastructure right in their backyard. I don't know. It's complicated.
Trustee Hildebrand?
Pretty happy with the list in item 3, except I would remove picnic tables.
I'm looking at that. I don't even remember why it's there. So I think we can, I'm sorry. We'll take that out.
So to kind of recap, so on number 1, I guess we're going to come back on whether, so where it's 0 and 20. I think there's been voicing kind of both ways. Number 2, setbacks measured, from the adjacent property line, that's just, I didn't hear any comments for or against on that one. And then on number 3, the following developments are exempt, removing picnic tables for sure. And I think that was where we were at. Does that seem?
I know, we have pended the parking discussion, and I see parking areas
yeah,
as a
right.
lot line issue that could possibly come out of the.
Okay.
Everyone has a homework assignment to go out and walk an open space area and tell us where the trail is and how, if it's 20 feet or not away from the property line, and report back. There we go.
A sign.
All right. So I think with that, oh, sorry, Commissioner Cohn. Yeah, I think you had a couple other
I made a couple
comments.
in A on that exhibit. I asked I know that development proposal is some special language that you planners like to use and everything like that. But to me, I wasn't sure if I was another person reading this, that I would think that was, private developers, and it didn't apply to a quote city project of some sort. But I don't know if there's a way that would, maybe that's not an issue. If it is an issue, then I was looking for an alternative term.
Alternative to development proposals.
What?
Yeah.
Or at least a alternative to development. Or saying to all public and private. I mean, maybe you don't have private ones in the open space area. I don't know. It struck me as raising this whole issue of you know, that some people say, it's the city we're worried about. It's not private developers in this respect.
That city, darn them.
Yeah.
So I can think creatively about that. I will just remind you that the zoning code, it guides permitting. And as the city is seeking permits for activities on the open space, that's what that section is saying.
Well, is development,
The construction of a trail would be a development proposal.
but is it defined anywhere, in the Mercer Island Code?
Eileen's gonna save me.
Yes, yes, indeed. The trouble with zoning codes is a lot of times it's like interlocking definitions. This is one of them. 1916-010 is the definitions portion of the code. It has development proposal, and like the city manager alluded to, it doesn't have to be a private development. It doesn't have to be like a subdivision or a new house. It's just sort of a general term for, hey, this activity is going to trigger a permit requirement at the city. So I understand from a layperson's perspective where there might be confusion, but if this is a technical part of the Mercer Island City Code, terms have particular defined meanings, and this one is defined.
Does that include, proposals for the city to be doing the development?
Oh, indeed. The city has to pull its own permits just like any other applicant would.
Well, again, with my reaction to the word, I don't have a strong feeling other than that. I mean, I can just hear some of the opponents of some things just saying, oh, great, we're gonna have parking, we're gonna have signs, we're gonna have art, and now we're gonna have development, developers coming in and develop. So I was looking for an alternative, but if that doesn't work, then it doesn't work.
Thank you. Trustee Bender.
Thanks. I just wanted to go back. I mean, I do strongly feel that parking needs to be removed from item 3. I just don't think parking within closer than 20 feet to a residential property is appropriate.
So the reason it's there is because the setback also applies to the right of way. So if parking is not exempted, that means, and you all decide to allow parking, that means we're pushing it into the center of the property off the road. And I don't think that's the intent.
Well, I'm sorry, the way I'm reading this, tell me if I'm wrong. It's 20 feet from an adjacent property that's residential.
Yeah, if you look at number 2, setbacks are measured from the adjacent property line or the edge of adjacent public rights of way. So you're also
Well,
talking.
so how do we go about saying you can't put it 20 feet from what is a residential property line as opposed to a right of way?
If the consensus is that needs to be resolved, I'm happy to add that to our list of
Yeah, I thought that's where we were. at.
parking issues to tackle.
Yeah.
Carson.
Okay.
Okay.
Trustee Hildebrand.
So just as a suggestion, we could remove the setback requirement from the right of way, considering the kinds of improvements that are going to be made in open space. It probably doesn't make sense to put a picnic table right up against the boundary between right of way and the actual edge of the park. On the other hand, it perfectly does make sense to put a fence there, for example. So, but even that's exempted, but I don't know, maybe you can come up with an idea of something else that would want to abut directly on that boundary line with the right of way.
Yeah.
I think this maybe, like you say, needs a little more polish, and we'll come back to it.
We will work on it.
Yep. Oh. Paul, yeah.
In support of Commissioner Cohen's discussion on section A, can we put in that the provisions of this section shall apply to all public development proposals? So it restricts any illusion that private development proposals would be entertained.
I suppose we could. I don't think we have a different definition for public or private development, but certainly we could. Another thought we could do is also just if we're concerned, because I do understand the Commissioner Cohen's concern, right? If for the public, right? If they're seeing development, I definitely understand that. One thing we could also do is put it in the staff report or the handoff letter to say, kind of explain it a little bit more, but you could certainly bake it into the code if that's a concern.
Well, why don't we take a poll? Okay, Commissioner Cohen.
Paul, isn't the risk of putting public before that going to give somebody the impression that private developments are unregulated in open space lands? That's what that would be my only concern.
I will also note that right now, the way the zone is written, right, if we go back up to subsection B, one of the requirements to even be in it is it has to be owned, leased, or managed by the city. And so then really that kind of gives the city more control as the property owner, right? Is we're not just a regulator. We would be the one applying for whatever it is. So it's not as if a private developer is going to come in and pull a permit for a city-owned piece of property. They would need permission from the city for that.
Okay, all right. So if we can move to restrooms, or no, Don, did you have any other? No, good, okay. So under restrooms, permitted on properties larger than 100 acres, so that I believe is only Pioneer Park. Restrooms shall not be larger than 200 square feet and have a height not to exceed 17 feet. I had some questions. And one was, by stating this maximum size of not larger than 200 feet, does that mean that porta potty facilities are allowed, or are they considered temporary and they can only be there for 180 days? Or I don't, is there a conflict there or not? I don't know. I just raise it.
I think the permanent porta potty at Pioneer Park is allowed under this code.
Okay.
It's,
And then I also was just wondering on the height of 17 feet for a bathroom building, is that standard or?
it is. I wish Eileen was here because I think we went and measured a restroom building because I knew that was going to come up. Sam, do you remember which buildings we were talking about?
Yeah, I think the most applicable was the Dean's Children's Park restroom that was deemed an appropriate size for that's like our smallest restroom.
Okay. When you see 17 feet, you go, really? Okay. But,
I knew somebody was going to bring that up.
all right. I don't.
You don't remember your former neighbor, Bill Russell?
RIP. Anybody else have any questions, thoughts on restrooms? Pretty straightforward.
Well,
Seeing none. Okay, so I think that takes care of development standards. We got some work to do on setbacks, parking, science trail standards. So a lot of work to do there, but
Here,
who's that?
me.
Oh, sorry.
I have a
Councilmember,
suggestion on
Secretary.
parking, and that is that subparagraph D4 be D1, because that takes a lot of the red flag out of this whole thing, because we're not really talking about much parking. And we're only talking about one space for 10 acres. So, aside from Pioneer Park, I mean, this is a nothing burger. And doing that, I think, just gets, calms the public, angst about this kind of thing considerably.
That's a good point. As we have some work to do about parking, certainly reordering those paragraphs puts the meat and the potatoes at front and center of the regulations. I think we have some other homework to do on parking as well before we come back.
Yeah.
Thank you for that.
All right. Ready for definitions. And we start with the kiosk, a small structure in a public area used for providing information. People have comments, and I believe Peter has a comment.
Well, my question was, how, do we need to define small?
So I think we are, where's my-
Or will that be in the development standard when?
oh, that's right. Okay, see, I'm, yeah, when we come back with the signs and kiosks, we will put in the development regulations, a maximum square footage or something, and that will,
Okay.
Okay, open space, sorry, thumbs up on that? Good. Open space lands, any undeveloped parcel of real property, although not necessarily completely natural and undisturbed, whose existing openness, natural conditions, or present state of use, if retained, would maintain or enhance the present or potential conservation of natural or scenic resources of MI, and which have been declared to be open space property by the city council with the intent that any future use of property would be limited to passive and low impact form of use. Open space lands must be owned, leased, or managed by the city of Mercer Island. Mr. Hildebrandt.
Yeah, open space is already defined in Mercer Island City Code 1901, let's see. 1916-010. And I like that definition better. This one is a restatement of the purpose of open space. And so it's kind of redundant. It's not really a definition if it refers back to something that is stated elsewhere, so.
I'm going to ask Eileen to respond to that definition. It exists in a different section of our code, and that's why we developed this one and called it open space lands. Eileen.
Precisely. So there's two different concepts of open space. So one is open space for purposes of this zoning code that we've been working through the last few weeks. One is open space as a mitigation measure from new development under, for example, the subdivision statute. If somebody's going to subdivide land, they have to make adequate provisions for like a laundry list of items. One of them is open space. Sometimes this is an open space easement or tract or something like that. And so what we were needing to do is have two different definitions. One for this is what it means in the context of the zone, and this is what it means in the context of, for example, subdivision regulations. And so we were having two separate definitions. We were thinking open space would be for purposes of development, private development as that's historically. Now I'm doing it too. Now I'm confusing development. But have that for, you know, mitigation of subdivisions, things like that. But open space lands would apply for, it would be a bespoke definition for this particular zoning code.
Okay, if I may continue, then I did write down an alternate definition to be considered, which is a parcel of land that is largely undeveloped and is suitable as a natural habitat.
And basically in there, you're eliminating kind of all of the purpose stuff that's in the current.
Which is redundant.
Which.
What's that? Yeah, we don't have any objection, and
Okay.
if you wouldn't mind,
Yeah, maybe we could put up on the screen.
yeah, that would be great. Could you restate that, please?
Slowly.
A parcel of land that is largely undeveloped.
Developed.
And is suitable as a natural habitat.
Any comments on that? And then if not, I'd like to just kind of
Keep going.
get a thumbs up or down as to the revision.
I guess
sorry,
I would
go ahead.
wonder if, is the fact that it's owned, leased or managed by City of Mercer Island under the purpose, is that not to be, need to be restated because?
I think we're probably okay, but what we'll do is with all these changes, is we'll go back with our attorney and make sure we didn't undo something unintentionally.
So could I just see a kind of consensus that we're acceptable to this? Thank you. And pending review by council.
Passive recreational amenities are structures, pieces of equipment or developments that are specifically provided for passive recreational use, such as signs, trails, restrooms, kiosks, benches. Seems good. Any discussion? Nods? Thumbs up?
Right.
Majority, good.
Oh, good question.
Where do
Yes.
bike racks fit in? Are they in that category? We'll continue to advocate for this.
Yeah, et cetera. Any issue with bike racks from staff?
No, if I were asked to interpret the code, I would presume that a bike rack would be an allowable use.
Just already with the wording as it is.
Yes, but
Okay.
if you'd like to add it for the sake of clarity, that would be your prerogative. Would you like us to add that?
Everybody, oh,
I would suggest if we're going to get, since we're really strict on parking and I don't know where parking's going, that we should allow bike racks, something.
well, I think like the way it's worded, such as, so.
Yeah.
But we're going to make it explicit, so explicitly calling out bike racks, thumbs up. All right. Good.
Okay, did we finish with passive recreational use?
It's like art.
There, thanks. Commissioner Hay?
Yeah, I have a question about pieces of equipment. Why would we have that in there? What kind of equipment are we talking about?
Oh,
Structures, pieces of equipment or developments.
Sam, do you know why we added that now that Lane's gone?
It's not ringing a bell right now.
We could probably strike that.
Jesse,
Okay.
Ryan Daly chiming in here. Pieces of equipment I was actually thinking was bike racks.
Okay.
But we added that, so that's just kind of what my thought was.
Paul.
Yeah, I don't know if the dog poop bags are considered equipment.
Okay.
We could also use just the blanket term furnishings if we didn't want to worry about including everything.
Whoever, was that Ryan? Oh, Sam.
Sam.
Okay.
Bam.
Sam.
All right. That does sound less construction equipment to me. People thumbs up on furnishings?
Oh.
Instead of pieces of equipment? Okay,
Marie has her hand up.
thank you. Marie, please.
Can I suggest that we just simplify things by simply saying that it's structures, furnishings, development specifically provided for passive recreational uses? Because the definition of passive recreational uses has a laundry list in it already.
That's a good point.
So we don't need the signs, trails, restrooms, blah, blah, blah. If it doesn't, help with the recreational use, then it can be done. And if it does, it can.
I'm seeing nods.
Yeah, so it would be structures, furnishings, or developments that are specifically provided for passive recreational uses, period.
Period, right.
Great.
Everybody good with that?
Does that include restrooms for third? Does it?
Well, restrooms.
Structures.
Yeah.
All right, so
Okay.
did we finish passive recreational uses? I think we did. Passive, yes. Anybody need to revisit that? And if not, we'll go on. When Carson scrolls down, temporary structures, uses and activities. There, did I skip?
No.
Okay. A land use structure or activity that will only be in place for a limited period of time, not to exceed 180 days in duration. Anyone want to argue that one?
So I have a clarifying question. Should there be a statement about not allowing for renewals of a certain temporary thing? I kind of the idea of it's 180 days, but if it's automatically renewed for, it becomes evergreen, if you will. I don't know if that should be called out or not.
I would recommend against that only because the temporary uses provision is truly intended to be 180 days. The situation that occurs when we would be extending a use would likely be tied to construction. We've got something temporary under construction. So I might consider just leaving it as is.
Okay.
All right, our last one is trail. Oh, sorry, do we need to do thumbs up?
Well, no, there's.
Good. And a trail is an off-street pedestrian, bicycle, or multi-use path, which sounds like horses to me, but.
Well, I
Yeah.
I had a comment that I submitted on that one. I didn't know whether multi-use was intended to be limited to pedestrian / bicycle or whether it was any multi-use path. And if it was the former, then I suggested that it be more specific. I don't know what was intended.
Well, I'm wondering, does this get to kind of, council members Jacobson's earlier comment about scooters and so forth? So I think we need to clarify on that.
Perhaps we can include horses and exclude motorbikes by saying non-motorized means of travel or non-motorized travel, or however you want to say.
Where does that put like electric bikes?
Yeah, right.
That would exclude electric bikes, and I'm good with that.
It's a hot topic. Good. Trustee Bender.
Thanks. I'm just wondering whether, again, we should eliminate the list and say it's a path designed for passive activities. And we've already got a laundry list of what those passive activities are. So we don't really need to have another list here if we've already got a list that defines the activities that are allowed. And I would also mention that motorized vehicles are prohibited in Pioneer Park. So multi-use to me is too bland a definition anyway, but maybe we just need to say it's the physical existence of a path designed to permit passive uses.
Maria, a moment ago, you said something like an off-street path for passive recreational uses. Was that?
Yeah, something like that. Because the uses will tell us what kinds of things can be on the path.
That revision works for staff.
Good. All right, thumbs up on that one.
All right.
Thank you. Thank you. And you don't need to do zone disturb. Do we do zone disturb?
So I did just want to point out the remaining pages of that draft code are, it's text lifted from our existing code. That the one change to existing code is under, Eileen, correct me if I'm wrong, it's under section A, where we're just showing that we've added open space. So I saw there were some comments from Commissioner Coleman about, I think it's H. And
These were just
yeah,
more Scrivener sort of things. In H 2 and 3, I thought the term open spaces should be open space lands to link back to to that.
This is exactly what we were just talking about, right?
Yeah.
The references to open spaces here is referring to the open spaces in the development code and distinctly different from open space lands in the new code. That's where
So which is it supposed to be here then?
it's supposed to be open spaces as written.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
And then in H3, is something garbled in the first phrase here?
Oh my gosh.
No yard or other open spaces provided abut any building or structure for the purpose of complying?
This is actually as it's written in the code, and we've had a few round robins with the council on that.
I can follow it, but
Yeah.
I'll leave that to you to resolve.
I just want to note for the record that as a lawyer who spends all day wordsmithing, I very much appreciate the attention to detail and the eye to Scrivener's error, because the devil is indeed in the details, and very much appreciated.
Well, I practiced a few years of municipal.
Oh.
law, so-
Oh my goodness. Well, then there you go.
Mhm.
Okay.
All right, trustee Bender.
Yeah, sorry. I mean, I would second Don's comment. And if now is the place where we could begin correcting this language, maybe we ought to. But it doesn't make any sense to me to say no yard or other open space provided a but. It seems to me like what it's supposed to say is spaces providing. It's no yard or other open spaces that abut any building or structure for the purpose of, I don't know. If we can begin to correct the language, we probably should, is, I guess, my comment.
I
Because it's
appreciate
clearly
that.
incomprehensible.
And we'll take that back to the council. I'm not recommending we touch any section of the rest of this code. And
Okay.
that section was actually, there's some history recently with that. But
I take your word for it.
Yeah, we don't love it.
Okay.
I guess before we conclude, we have some homework assignment. You'll see another staff report next Friday. I need to spend some time with my city clerk figuring out when we meet again in 2 weeks, how you all will vote. I think you may have to vote as independent bodies. It's been a while, but we would like you to have one more joint meeting together so that you can review the draft code and the handoff memo. I'm also going to be asking the chairs to do a pre-review of the handoff memo and help us just get the language more correct before we publish next Friday. And I think that's all for me.
Okay. Carson.
Did we want to have a quick discussion on additional recommendations to outline in the handoff memo?
Did you want to rattle those off on your list really quick?
One sec.
Yeah, what Carson is referring to is that there was going to be a transmittal memo that will accompany the actual zoning code document. And in that, we can express preferences. For example, I think as we talked about, we always prefer less to more kind of thing. We might, and I'll let you go through some other ones we've kind of thought about.
At your last meeting, we had a sheet of white paper, and every time you said something, we said we can't fix it in the code, but we'll write it in your memo. We wrote it down. So a couple of things like the wireless, should the council revisit the wireless communications facilities code? You wanted the open spaces to be the lowest priority. That's one example. What else was on our list, Carson?
We have addressed other open space areas and parks, so that's going to be addressed with the subsequent item.
And the private open space conversation that we had earlier.
So basically there will be has just additional recommendations that are fall without or out of the scope of this project.
Was there anything else? Those were the handful we had from last time.
What about the whole concept of, I think I mentioned this when you were called out today, that Ryan Daly had told us that the city was going to be embarking on a review of bicycles, electric bikes, and a park system wide. And I don't know, we've kind of talked about that and there were differences in viewpoint on some of these things here. So I don't know if that's
Yeah, city,
still on the table.
Ryan's correct, and even citywide, if we can come up for air at some point, we have to, our citywide regulations don't address, scooters, in right of ways or on parks. So that is a future work item. Tell me how you'd like that referenced in the memo, just that it's important to you and you'd like to be a part of the process, or?
Scooters and electric bikes received minimal discussion, but was it, great interest?
Yeah.
Participation.
Okay.
Yeah.
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 Okay.
And it might warrant, if I heard Marie say that they're not allowed in Pioneer Park, it might be good to
Mhm.
specify that.
Good point. All right, trustee Bender.
Sorry, but I feel like we're going in a direction that says we're not going to discuss whether bikes are allowed or not allowed in open spaces. And I just want to be clear, at least my view is that we ought to be making a decision in the open space zoning, whether bikes, whether they're pedaled or electric, are allowed in open spaces, separate and aside from the citywide considerations. Is that where everybody else is thinking?
I thought it was in the rules specific to each park, and you're saying we should address it among us?
When this came up earlier, my recommendation was that the zone basically allow or stay silent on bikes and equestrians, and that they
Okay, okay.
be regulated by park rules or open space rules, but that's my recommendation. Because we have inconsistency right now across the system, so I would be concerned about banning something that's allowed right now and creating some problems.
Okay.
All right. Right, but I know it's almost 8:30, but I wanted to, this is generally for the Park and Recs, it's our normal monthly meeting, and I was just wondering if any of the commissioners, I guess, or trustees had any reports of activities that they wanted to discuss or indicate. Well, I think I have one. I wanted to give a shout out to Eagle Scout. This is from the Mercer Island Reporter yesterday. A fellow named Quinn Shavy, and led a project that built a fence to protect children playing in the Island Crest Park playground from bikers in the new bike skills area. This provided a clear line for where the bike area is and helps to protect children playing in the playground. And I know many of the commissioners had expressed that concern, and I just wanted to recognize Quinn's effort there. And I talked to Sam before the meeting, and Sam was and the city was involved with this Eagle Scout project, and so kudos to Quinn. So with that, I think we go to our script. Bear with me. Gotta find it now. Yes, I can. Here we go. Okay.
There.
All right. So the next regular Open Space Conservancy Trust meeting is another joint meeting with the Parks and Recreation Commission, and is scheduled for Thursday, April 18th, beginning at 5 p.m. There being no other business to come before the Parks and Recreation Commission and the Open Space Conservancy Trust, the time is now 8:26 p.m. and the meeting is adjourned.
This, as a reminder to the commissioners and trustees, please stay seated until the city staff has terminated the broadcast. Good evening, and thank you for joining us.